Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto falls in love with a dragon in a fairy tale. Before I start, please support for more amazing content, and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by sgcassidy and link in description and support writer. Let's start the video. Prologue. He was found on the remains of a battlefield, wrapped in the arms of a red-haired woman as she lay on the ground struggling to hold on to the last remains of her life. Choking on air as she did her best to keep breathing, though she knew it was a struggle she was doomed to lose. She had no magic left in her system either, and without that there was little hope for her survival. The battle had wounded her, internal bleeding would be the end of her, and without magic she had no way to rise and search for help or a healer. It should have been a consolation that at least her son would survive, but with her life slowly fading she knew he had no chance of surviving in this desolate place without help. Would our sacrifice have been in vain? She wondered as she stared at his soft sleeping face. A tear slowly leaked from the corner of her eye, slipping down until it hit the floor with a splash. It all seemed so cruel for it to end this way. She looking on at the sleeping face of her child, knowing that there was nothing she could do to save him from this fate. She choked slightly, a trail of blood dripping from the corner of her mouth as she managed to spit out some of the blood that clogged her throat. How much time do I have left? She wondered. A minute? Less. It was then that she felt it. A sudden slam that hit the earth and sent quakes shuddering through the surrounding land. It shook her to her very core and invariably had the consequence of waking the blonde-haired baby in her arms. His blue eyes flickering open as he yawned sleepily, surveying his surroundings with a disorientated look until he recognized the familiar red hair of his mother and smiled. A little hand reaching up to touch her face. Even though the situation was still dire, she was unable to stop herself smiling faintly in return. Unable to stop herself returning her son's affection even now. That is until another quake followed. It was smaller than the first, but still shook the earth with its power. Then another came, followed by another until the sounds were following in quick succession, slowly gaining in volume and power. If it wasn't for the power of the shaking she would have thought them footsteps, but she knew nothing large enough to make such noise. Still, it was a thought that remained faintly in the back of her mind. She would have tried to take a look at the cause of the shaking, but she was unable to even move her head. It was pitiful she knew, but there was little she could do to assuage the situation, even if the shaking was almost disturbing enough to distract her from her impending death. Not even the happy smile on her son's face could change that. In fact, it stabbed at something in her heart. If only I could just. She tried desperately to search for her magic, reaching as deep as she could, but there was nothing. Not even a trickle to call on to keep her boy safe. But she was so close to death's door her fingers would even tremble. If it had been within her range of capabilities she would have shouted out her frustration to the sky. If that were possible though, then she wouldn't have reason to. Then she could save him. Instead all she could do was lay in the dirt and blood on the battlefield, longing to feel her husband's arms around her once again. Longing for the energy to protect her son, longing for life. In the end that's all she wanted. Another quake shook the ground. And so, she thought, what will happen now? Chapter 1. Ka-san, said a soft voice as little hands gently rubbed her snout, scratching at the scales there. A rumble started deep in her chest, settling at the back of her throat in a contented purr. Though a wise man would never call it a purr. She was a dragon after all, and she had her pride. Ka-san, he repeated, his voice vibrating with her purr as it shook his little body. He waited several moments for her response, and as he expected he got none. His mother really did hate the daytime. It's not that she wasn't a morning person, she just wasn't a daytime person, period. As such it wasn't an easy task waking her up in the morning, but it was something that had to happen. Even if it meant he'd end up flying out the cave. Sighing to himself he climbed off her snout and walked round her body, completely slumped in resignation. This was going to hurt. He even found his face involuntarily twitching in phantom pain the closer he got to his destination. It wasn't just going to hurt. It was really going to hurt. Running a hand through soft blonde hair he stared down at the way to wake her up. To rouse the sleeping dragon. Gathering his courage he reached down and took hold of her tail, sucked in a deep breath and yanked. Here it came. A roar shot through the cave and her tail went whipping through the air. Unfortunately for Naruto he was still attached to said tail, and was sent sailing out the cave. A look of resignation on his face, at least until he smashed face first into a large boulder. The rest of his body then joining his face in impact, sending little fissures along the rock's surface before his injured body then slid down the rock, landing in a crumpled heap on the floor. There was the sound of several earth-shaking thumps before a large scaly body emerged from within the large cave. Considered large even amongst her own kind, the female dragon was an equally beautiful and majestic creature. Her body covered almost head to toe in black scales that shimmered blue faintly in the morning light. The only hint in dissension of the color were the white slivery scales around the claws of her hands and feet. She stared down at the fallen boy and shook her head in exasperation. Naruto-kun, why is it every morning when I tell you to wake me up I find you incapacitated in front of that rock? She asked exasperatedly. No reply was given, not that she really expected one. He tried to tell her several times that when he woke her up she flung him into the rock with her tail, but she refused to believe him. She wasn't a violent dragon and there was no way she'd lose control of herself that way, even in sleep. It simply wasn't in her nature. Eventually he'd given up trying to explain to her that it was in fact what happened, and had just taken his morning face plant with grim resignation. Sighing in exasperation, she moved forward and nudged him with her nose, rolling him onto his back, his limbs flopping limply by his sides. Whatever he was doing, she was sure, was quite exaggerated. Nothing but a dragon could incapacitate a dragon slayer in training so badly, except perhaps a powerful mage. Given that there were no mages in the immediate vicinity, and she was the only dragon there at all, she assumed he was clearly being dramatic. After all, it wasn't her that put him in this situation, and so he should be fine. Naruto-kun, wake up or I will find an ocean, drop you in the middle of it, and make you swim back, she said. Actually, that's not a bad idea, she thought. It would be good to test the limits of his constitution. Ka-san, please don't, he mumbled, as he struggled to a standing position. Then stop dramatizing. I will accept nothing less than 110% of your effort. As the dragon slayer of one of the most powerful dragons, I expect nothing less than perfection, she said arrogantly. Though even if said in arrogance it was true, she stood on a level above many other dragons. Knowing only one stood above her and few, but her brother could stand on equal footing with her. Hi Ka-san, he said, standing up straight at her words and giving a small bow. Good, now any idea what we will be doing today? She asked. What we have been doing for the last year, Ka-san, he answered. A year which had involved the pain of getting slammed into that rock every morning. And what have we been doing for a year? She asked. Naruto resisted the urge to sigh. She asked him every morning, testing his knowledge despite the fact that she knew the answer. I am to follow you around, mimicking any and all of your actions in an attempt to assimilate any and all information I can in order to become a dragon slayer that is truly equal and worthy of his master, he replied, repeating all she told him the first time, then gave another small bow at the end of the answer, as she always expected. He actually wasn't entirely sure what some of those words meant, but understood the basic principle, and could repeat what she told him well enough. Correct, she smirked, and now with that out the way, let us be off. And with that said, she flared out her wings and took off. Naruto sighed. It was really cruel of her to continuously overlook the fact that he couldn't fly. Naruto could do nothing but stare at the floor in complete exhaustion as he walked up the pathway to the cave. Why me? He lamented. Why did I have to be stuck with a dragon hell-bent on training me to death? Naruto! That doesn't look at all how I walk. She cried. It reeks of defeat. Does my walk reek of defeat? Defeat? No, Ka-san, he replied. Pulling himself together, he shifted his stance, his body taking on a more predatory appearance. Or at least it would if he was older than 5. Better, he heard her rumble as he continued his walk up, using up his remaining energy to sink gracefully into his seat next to the large dragon instead of just collapsing to the ground. He didn't want her ranting about the difference between collapsing onto the ground and the way she sat down. They sat in companionable silence for several moments before she spoke. Naruto-kun, I have been taking a look at your magical continuer lately, and when will you teach me that, Ka-san? He interrupted. When you've learned all you need to learn, then you will know, she replied. He pouted. Why'd she always have to say that? It made no sense. When you've learned all you need to learn, he mimicked sarcastically. Will you let me continue now? She asked. He nodded. Good, now as I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, I've been taking a closer look at your magical container lately, and something has come to my attention. She paused as if unsure how to explain it to him. Naruto-kun, what can you tell me about the different types of magic? Do you remember your lessons? Hi Ka-san, he said, even now giving a little bow of his head as she drilled into him. Apparently she wanted constant courtesy and respect. There are several categories to magic. However, what is important to know is that any magic can be learned by anyone if they have the knowledge and power to do so. Unfortunately, it's really hard to learn even one magic and become proficient in it. Never mind more than one, which is why people specialize. Being extremely good at one is better than being just okay with a lot. Of course, getting the knowledge, as most mages don't write down the secrets to their magic, especially if it's a powerful one, which is why you normally need a good teacher. Right, Ka-san? She nodded. Mostly correct. Mostly? He repeated, look at her with watering eyes. But she remained immune. Yes, mostly, she repeated. He sighed. Carry on then, she said. Fine if you insist. There's the magic you inherit called innate, or inborn magic, which means that without even learning it, the magic is simply something that comes naturally to you. An innate magic that is usually showed when people unlock their magic. You did mention that most of the time it's hereditary. I think you said that elemental affinity is similar to that. Those with an affinity to a certain element will always be able to perform the magic better than others. It's something you're born with, though you did mention that if a child starts training extremely young it can be taught, though most mages don't start training young enough to do so. Which is why I'm confused about why you won't train me to get an elemental affinity, he said as he flicked a stone down the slope. Because you're learning Dragon Slayer magic, that's why, she retorted. You also forgot to mention people like celestial mages who use holder magic. Do I have to? He begged. She gave him a look. He pouted. Sighing, she decided to let it go. It wasn't relevant to what she wanted to tell him anyway. Right, well then you get stuff like Dragon Slayer magic, which is what's the word for not common again, Ka-san? He asked. Rare. Yeah, my magic's rare. It's part of a category called lost magic, which is older magic of which there is little knowledge of. It isn't a magic that requires an inborn talent to use, it just requires the right teacher, knowledge and power. It's the close to the one magic which is considered the origin of all other magics, and where they come from. However, finding anything on the magic is obviously kind of hard to come by, he said with a smile. But I got one big source of Dragon Slayer knowledge sitting right next to me. Cheeky brat, she growled. Ka-san, you're too kind, he agreed with grin. Anyway, you never let me finish, Ka-san. There's also forbidden magics which are forbidden for a reason. They usually cause great harm to the user and to the people around them. It can also be evil if it's a magic that requires living sacrifice. She nodded her head in agreement and smiled to herself. He really was a bright boy. At least 95% of the time. It was that last 5% that made her occasionally want to bang his head against the wall. Do you remember why I made you tell me all of that again? She asked. Well, I'm assuming it wasn't to refresh your memory, he remarked. She growled. Hey, I said I'm assuming it's not. Anyway, it must have something to do with my magic container, he said with a smile. Correct, she replied. You see, most dragons chose dragon slayers that have an affinity towards their particular element. Given that what I use is not really an element, and therefore almost impossible for a human to be aligned to, that is not that case. Ka-san? He questioned. The reason you are able to use my magic is because it is a lost magic, and lost magic can be taught to anyone. However, you have slowly built an affinity towards my magic, which is generally what happens when a dragon picks a child that doesn't share an affinity, she said. Oh, I guess that's why you never wanted me to build another affinity, he said, feeling slightly dazed. She nodded. But that is not what I wanted to talk to you about. He looked at her sharply. It's about your natural inborn magic, she said. Ah, what? I have an inborn magic, he exclaimed. That's so cool. What is it? He expected an immediate reply, and when he didn't get one, he observed her more closely. Did she seem uneasy? Finally she answered, the same magic your human mother had, takeover magic. That's so cool. I can do. Wait, how do you know what her magic was? He asked. Is she psychic? He wondered. I was there when she died. I watched the final moments of the battle that killed her. Naruto stared at her for several moments in shock. When the words finally seemed to sink in, he jumped to his feet, body shaking with anger. You saw her die. You saw the battle that killed her. You could have saved her, he yelled, his small fists beating uselessly at the scales on her sides. Why didn't you save her, Naruto? She barked, and he froze instinctively, his body reacting to his automatic response to obey her. What do I always say? Keep your emotions under control or they control you, he replied stiffly. Then he snapped. But this is different. No, it's not. It's a perfect opportunity to learn how difficult that can truly be. Feel emotion. Never stop feeling it, but do not let it control you, she ordered. He sat back down, his body tense and trembling. She sighed. Besides, you weren't listening to me. I said I saw the final moments, not the entire thing. No matter what I did, I wouldn't have been quick enough to save her, the dragon replied. He looked over at her before glaring at the floor. Finally he spoke. You promise? I swear on my honor as a dragon, she replied. Naruto nodded. She'd never lie when her honor was at stake. Still, there was a heavy silence that lingered for several moments. She named you, you know. What? Not what? Pardon, she automatically correct. Pardon? He repeated, not bothering to fight about it. There were more important things to think about. When I found her, she was just barely alive. No magic left, but enough life to tell me your name when I told her what I intended to do for you, she explained. Is that the only reason you picked me? He asked. Because I was just a human child you stumbled upon by luck? Never. I would have taken you to a nearby town had I found you unworthy, she replied. I watched the final moments of that fight, and even if I had not seen the entire thing, I saw the bodies littered on the floor. Bodies wearing the same uniform as who were attacking her. Which meant she'd been fighting them all and winning. She showed such fighting spirit. The spirit of a dragon. I knew that there was no possible way such a strong spirit could fade without even the smallest part of it passing on to her child. Naruto sniffed slightly, wiping tears away from the corners of his eyes. Do you know her name? He asked. No, unfortunately yours was the only name she gave. But I think you share a surname, and so that is something to think on, I suppose. That, however, is not why I brought this topic up. He could take a guess at what she really wanted to talk about, my takeover magic. Hi, your takeover magic. I will be giving you 2 days off every week to work on this magic, she explained. But who'll teach me? He asked confusedly. She sighed. Naruto, what do you know of innate magic? She asked. He paused for several seconds to think over what she wanted before his eyes light with recognition. Innate magic is not something to be learned, only perfected. It comes instinctively to the user, and only practice perfects and betters their skill. Which means you already have the knowledge to use your magic. You just have to find it. I do fear though that using Dragon Slayer magic has suppressed your other magic and is part of the reason you cannot simply use it instinctively. So, during your meditation periods, instead of working on finding and controlling the night's light, I want you to search for this magic and knowledge. Understood? Hi, Ka-san, he nodded. His voice still a little shaky from his earlier tears. Good, now off to bed. Hi Ka-san, he repeated. Okay, he thought as he sat on the large rock by the river. Ka-san said I have to find this other magic inside of me, which honestly seems like it could be some really cool magic if what Ka-san taught me is true. Come on, focus, he muttered out loud. Meditation was no easy task, especially for a boy who was only nearing his 6th year, but he certainly did well despite that. It might have been because he'd been practicing such a thing since he turned 3, even so it was a great achievement. His Ka-san had told him so, saying that the speed with which he could fall into a meditative state was impressive, as was the time he could hold it. She then said it wasn't nearly good enough. Very little was to her. She was a perfectionist, and expected him to perfect each and every technique she taught him. She wouldn't accept any excuses. In regards to meditation, she wanted him to be able to fall into the state instantly. Of course, she'd also promised him a way to use it in battle once he did. While he knew it helped him gain a better understanding of his powers and therefore greater control over them, he wasn't sure how he could use it in battle. He shrugged. It wasn't for him to know yet. What he was to learn now was, deep breaths, he thought, in and out, and ignore the fly that is buzzing round your face, and out. Ignore it, in and out, ignore it, in and out. Come on, Naruto. Ignore it. It landed on his nose. His face twitched. He snapped. His eyes flicked open with a snap, and with a viciousness he reserved only for flies that interrupted his meditation, he grabbed the offending thing off his nose with lightning speed and crushed it with satisfaction. A dark grin on his face. Naruto! He heard and winced. Stop messing around and meditate. How does she always know? He muttered. Now, hi Ka-san! He yelled in reply and returned to his earlier position. In and out. Chapter 2. Naruto sat on the same boulder he always used to meditate, fiddling with a piece of hair, staring at it with frown on his face. It looked much paler than it had last time he'd taken the effort to look at it, and he wasn't sure why. In fact, he was sure even his skin was looking lighter. He'd never been a boy overly concerned by his aesthetic appearance. On the contrary, he cared nothing for it at all. He had no reason to. He'd never seen another human before in all his time with the training-obsessed dragon, and he had no memory of a life before her. Given that he'd never really given a second thought to how he might appear to other people. He didn't know if he was considered short for his age or tall for his age. He didn't know if the way he looked was thought handsome or hideous. In fact, he wasn't entirely sure if he looked much like other humans at all. This was made true even more so by the fact that he never had the opportunity to look in the mirror. He was 10 years old now, and he'd never even seen his reflection. It wasn't like he hadn't felt his own face with his hands before, he just had nothing to compare his features to. Sure, he'd taken the time to look at the surface of the water and seen what he could, but it wasn't exactly a clear image. At the time, all he'd been able to glean was that he had bright blonde hair and blue eyes. Now that might be changing, and he wanted to know why. Maybe it happens to all humans as they get older, he thought. They get paler and paler until they're nothing but white sheets. The idea had some merit, he supposed, but surely he'd have been taught it in one of his lessons by now. It seemed like something pretty important to mention. Then again, she had a habit of just expecting him to know things like they were common sense. He sighed. He was going to have to ask her. Grumbling to himself, he climbed to his feet, enjoying the light of the moon on his back despite his irritation. It was always such a soothing feeling. Until he turned 8, she'd refused to let him train after sunset. His powers always felt greater at night, and she'd stated that until his control was much better he wouldn't be allowed to use them at night. When he turned 8, she decided he was ready, and he'd finally been allowed to train under the light of the moon. It was the first time he'd ever experienced using his powers at night, and it was a feeling he'd never forget. Such calmness, such serenity, such power. He could have praised its awesomeness till the cows came home. He jumped down the last few rocks, landing silently on his feet, his movement so smooth that even the sound of his body moving through the air made no noise. A little grin played at the corner of his mouth. She would be proud that her ruthless drilling had paid off. Suddenly a flicker of light hair caught his attention, and he remembered why he was there. Ka-san, he called as he walked around the corner of the cave, a slight frown now marring his face. Naruto, you're finished with your meditation? She asked. Hi Ka-san, he replied, then paused uncertainly. He wasn't entirely sure how to broach the subject of his sudden increasing paleness. He supposed straight up front asking would be the best route. She always preferred him to be that way. Ka-san, is there in particular reason that my hair is getting lighter? And not just my hair, but my skin too. In fact, is there any reason for my all-around increasing paleness? She stared at him for several moments before looked up and out at the moon. It comes from bathing in the moonlight, she replied. Bathing in the moonlight? He questioned uncertainly. That sounded just a little weird. Hi, she replied. It is the mark of dragon, slayer of the night and moon. We are not one or the other. We are both, one and the same. Our powers increase once the sun has set, though they are strongest when it is a clear night, and both night and moon are there to bless us. It is not that we are weaker when the sun is out and the night is day. After all, the moon is always there even when we cannot see it. But you already know that. He nodded. The only problem is the increase in power you feel in the night. I am a dragon, and as such the power doesn't affect me like it does you. I don't mean that my power doesn't increase like yours, I simply mean that my body was born and made to handle it. Even if you are a true dragon slayer, and your body possesses the resilience of when it isn't the same, the increasing paleness is a side effect of using your powers at night, she explained. Even with your control absolutely perfect, the power is something that floods your every pore. It affects you on a physical level. I still don't get why it should change me, he said, not truly understanding. It's a side effect. It is beyond even my knowledge how the nature of each magic acts at such a level of understanding. It is not knowledge any mortal should possess, and even if I am a dragon and my lifespan far outstrips yours, I am still mortal, and one day in the far distant future I will die, she explained. Does that mean I'll eventually be pale as a ghost? He asked in slight worry. He didn't want to completely lose something that connected him to his parents. No, well, maybe if you stopped using your powers completely. But you should know that your eyes aren't getting lighter, they are getting darker. Either way, I don't think it'll change much more than it already has. Your skin will never lose the slightly peach pigment, your hair will always retain a part of its blonde, and your eyes will always be blue no matter how dark. At least this effect won't be responsible for changing it, she said. He sighed in relief, then frowned. If the rest of me is getting lighter, why are my eyes going the other way? The moon is not all light and the night is dark. Even if it is mostly the moon, not the night, that is causing this change, there are always parts of one aspect within another, she said. He nodded in agreement. Is it permanent? I just explained that. Weren't you listening? Even if you stop using your powers at night, the change won't reverse, she explained. Anyway, enough of that. We've got live combat to work on, and I really am looking forward to beating you into the ground. Ka-san, why must you be so cruel? It's fun, she replied, not bothering to deny her training was slightly sadistic. Dragon Force, she stated. The ultimate state and power of the Dragon Slayer, he replied. She grinned, sharp teeth glinting in the light. It would have had anyone fleeing to the hills, but Naruto had seen the look too many times to be scared by it. I'm glad to see you remember it. The last time I mentioned it, you demanded I teach it to you that very instant, she said, continuing to grin. I was 4, he said, deadpan look on his face. That's no excuse. I remember you saying that when you sent me flying into a rock several miles away and letting me walk back. The grin got darker. It was a test of your tenacity. I'm sure it was, he replied, trying to keep the sarcasm from his voice. The question is why you're bringing it up now? He asked. I'm going to teach you how to achieve that state, she said, deciding it best to ignore the hint of sarcasm before she launched him miles away. He frowned. I thought you said it was impossible for a dragon slayer to activate it of their own free will unless a lacrima was infused in their bodies or they defeated their dragon. You also refused to do that to me last time I asked. In fact, you decided to repeat the earlier incident of hurling me miles away, only this time it was far enough away for me to land in the ocean. It took me day to get back. Feeling talkative today, how rare, she said, smirking. He frowned. Besides, I never said it was impossible, she added. You implied it. Yes, I did. I refused to turn you into one of those cheating fake dragon slayers. Any dragon who does that to their slayer clearly fears they won't be powerful enough. Weaklings and fools, all of them. It is possible for a true dragon slayer to achieve the dragon force state of their own free will without defeating their dragon. It's just incredibly difficult to accomplish. It is also made more likely for you to achieve it because I am your dragon. The more powerful the dragon, the greater chance the dragon slayer has of attaining the dragon force state, she explained. The methods also differ slightly from dragon slayer to dragon slayer. Alright then, how do I do it? He asked with a raised brow. Meditation, she replied. Meditation? He repeated dubiously. Hi, meditation. Don't you remember me telling you there was a greater purpose to your meditation? Well, meditation is how you unlock your dragon force state. But I've been meditating for years and I've never managed to do that. He exclaimed. That's only because you've been doing it wrong. She waved it away. I've meditating wrong for years and you never told me, he deadpanned. You haven't been meditating wrong, you just haven't been meditating right to achieve it. He refrained from any form of action, knowing he'd probably do something stupid and irrational which would then lead to her sending him flying far, far away. It just wouldn't be worth it. He took several deep breaths before he spoke again. How am I supposed to meditate then? In the middle of battle, she replied. Silence. Can you repeat that please? He said in a small voice. You need to be able to fall into a meditative state during the middle of a fight. It's not quite the same kind of meditation you've been doing, but it's similar enough to work. Oh, she took no notice of his dazed state. What you need to do is completely immerse yourself in your core during a state of meditation whilst in battle, and your magic will react to your state. It might be slightly more difficult for you because you have 2 different kinds of magic, but it will still work given enough practice. The meditative state isn't so much about meditation as it is about reaching a place of complete calm, serenity and balance in the midst of battle. Oh, he repeated. This wasn't going to be easy. No, it was not. Sure, he could reach a meditative state fairly easy now, but doing that in the middle of battle he had to resist using the word impossible. Whilst he knew she could be on the unreasonable side with his training, she wouldn't ask him to do something impossible. And when you do manage to achieve it, I'll tell you my name, she added. His head snapped to her. Really? He said, knowing he sounded rather pathetic, but not really caring. He'd been begging her to tell him for years. I will, she said, looking deep into his eyes. Then I'd go to do it, he thought. When do we start? She smirked. Right now. Why can't I get it? He mentally screamed in frustration, kicking a stone as he walked past it. He doubted his anger was helping any either, but he couldn't control it right now. He'd never found himself so frustrated with a technique in his life. He usually grasped spells so easily, understanding them far quicker than most would. It was irritating to suddenly find himself up against this wall he couldn't overcome, like that stupid rock he'd been acquainted with every morning. It was a huge annoying barrier that wouldn't break no matter how many times he slammed into it. He knew it would be more difficult to learn than any technique he'd ever had to learn before. In fact, he knew it would be far more difficult to learn than it had been to perfect his most advanced techniques so far. He growled out loud. Jumping down several rocks on the mountain, he eventually reached the cave and stalked to the back of the cavern. Maybe the previous dragon slayer who'd been here had advice. He remembered the first time he'd stumbled across the books at the back of the cave in a hidden room. He'd been around 6 years old, and completely mind-boggled by the number of books back there. Sure, he was taught how to read and write, but he'd never actually wondered where the books he was taught with came from. They'd always just been there. Then he'd stumbled across the room and realized that this was where they came from. He'd asked her where they'd come from and had just received a snort in reply. Finally she deigned to say, "The last dragon slayer I trained was a bookworm." It was into this room he stalked, temper still flaring as he began searching through piles of books for something useful. A confused voice interrupted his search. "Naruto, what on earth are you doing?" she asked. "Looking for book that might help me get this dragon force state down," he replied. "Well, you won't find one," she replied. "Why not?" he yelled. "Control yourself," she replied sharply. "Gomen," he apologized, trying to get himself under control. It was the only way he would get his answer, it seemed. He breathed deeply for several moments before asking once again, "Why won't I find anything?" he asked. "The last dragon slayer I had never managed to learn it," she said simply. He stared at her for several moments. "Are you serious?" "Hi. Then how on earth do you expect me to learn it?" he questioned, trying not to fall apart. It was freaking hopeless, and she didn't seem the least fazed. How did she even know it was possible? "Because I do," she answered. "If you don't, you'll never learn my name." After all, she never did. She then proceeded to wander off without a care in the world, leaving him to his thoughts. He spluttered. The woman was completely insane. How did she expect him to learn anything like this? He slumped. "I'm going to be old and gray before I learn this technique. I just need to." "Suki no Kuraisokumen, dark side of the moon," he murmured. It wasn't an offensive spell necessarily. He wasn't dumb enough to do that in a room full of books, though he was sure his teacher would beg to differ, but it was extremely useful in battle. It was also one of the most advanced techniques he knew, requiring a great deal of control to perfect and work properly. It also used up far too much magic power if cast incorrectly or if not controlled properly. A glowing white magic circle appeared both above and below his body. A wave of first silver then black seemed to shimmer over his body before slowly fading away. Feeling the flow of magic charge through his body always calmed his nerves ever so slightly. He sometimes wondered if it was just a side effect of his magic, even his take-over magic was affected by his dragon slayer magic, or if everyone felt that when they used magic. It could also just have been one of his quirks. Either way, he didn't really care. All he knew was that it calmed him, and that was that. Maybe one day when he met another wizard he would ask. Sighing deeply as the anxiety faded away, he slowly walked away from the books, his footsteps seeming lighter than before. Then in an unexpected move he didn't head for the door, instead walking straight through the wall, disappearing deeper into the cave as he sometimes did when he felt so frustrated. He was breathing deeply, his body shifting through forms in the light of the moon, the pale skin of his body glowing a faint sliver as he worked his way through several stances. After much contemplation, meaning many more failed attempts at getting it to work, he decided that this was the best way to eventually reaching the dragon force state. After all, you can't climb over a figurative wall thousands of feet high in an instant. You need to find a ladder and climb there slowly. Sure, he'd taken beginning steps to help by being able to fall into a meditative state almost instantly, but that was when he was sitting down on a rock at the top of a mountain with only the sounds of nature around him. Trying to do the same thing in the midst of a fight was a whole different ball game. A very annoying, irritating, frustrating one. So, he decided that he'd take it one step at a time, because getting his ass handed to him every fight with the dark dragon simply because he was trying to do two things at once was beginning to hurt a bit too much than he cared for. This was the solution. To be able to fall into a meditative state whilst moving through the various stances and forms he used in fighting. He was actually grateful he had any. Whilst watching his teacher had certainly been helpful in getting movement down, it didn't suddenly give him the power to take her down and destroy anyone in a fight with ease. In fact, he still got his ass handed to him on a daily basis, even with a style to fight with. But he was grateful for his predecessor giving him a fighting chance. She had been the one who'd had the books on it. Apparently she'd enjoyed hand-to-hand combat. Of course, getting the moves down right hadn't been easy either. He tried to mimic what he saw and read in the books, but there was only so much they could teach you. Getting them right had involved a lot of mistakes and enjoyable sessions with his teacher where she picked his form apart and sent him flying into rocks left and right. And if it wasn't a rock, it was a tree. He was sure there were still holes in his form, but he would only be able to fix those after facing humans in hand-to-hand combat. But for what little he'd had to work with, he thought he did fairly well, and the results were displayed at present. It was, he found, A lot easier to fall into a calm state whilst moving through the stances, but he wasn't quite there yet. He just needed a little more, some sort of little push, and he'd finally be able to get it. Once he did, he even had a follow-up plan. To be able to do the same thing whilst casting magic. He thought it would be harder than this. After that, he planned on combining the two. Having to do both magic and move through his stances at the same time whilst achieving that state of mind. Of course, there was the whole bathing in you magic thing, but he'd try that only after he'd managed everything else. Finally, after all of that, he'd attempt to fight his teacher. It would take a long time, he was well aware. In fact, he knew it could possibly take years. He just hoped he managed to achieve it one day, then he could finally learn her name. Yeah, it was sad to think his motivation was actually just learning her name more than anything else. There was the thrill of finally getting a technique down, but he'd be damned if he never managed to learn her name. He began his next kata. His body picking up speed as the faint glow around him seemed to increase ever so slightly as his magic flared. He learned if it was the last thing he ever did. Chapter 3. Naruto, she said, her voice far graver than usual. I'll be leaving soon. The 13-year-old spun round and stared at her in shock. Blinked for several seconds, then continued to stare in shock. What? When? Why? I'll be leaving soon. On the 7th of July, she repeated. But that's in a few days. He cried. Indeed it is, she responded. He stared at her. I should have actually had you leave to go and explore the world when I told you the secret to the Dragon Force. It's not something I can really teach you, and to be honest, you've learned all you need to learn from me, she said. He continued to stare. Well, it's not that you've learned everything or that you can do every spell perfectly and without the slightest flaw. You can do most, but not all. There are still things you need to learn. But honestly, I think the best learning tool for you right now would be experience. He stared. Though a small part of his brain was swearing at her perfectionist views, she continued, rambling though she'd never admit it. Sure, you fight me every day, but that isn't all that helpful in your continued progress. Yes, you get better at fighting me and fighting in general, but you need to learn to fight other opponents too. Learn when to use full power or to moderate it, how your style has to shift and change depending on the magic you face. Really, I should have let you go a while ago. I guess in a way it's selfish of me, but you're going, he finally spoke. I mean, really going? She nodded. Will I even see you again? Ever? He asked. I wish I could answer that. I really do, but even I'm not entirely sure. I hope so. Perhaps someday, but not anytime soon, she replied. There was silence for several moments. Where are you going? He asked. We're being recalled, every single one of us. I can't tell you where though. Even letting you know why I'm going isn't really something I should be doing. Thankfully though, my standing grants me some leniency and I can get away with it, she replied. So, it's not just you then. It's all the dragons, you're all being recalled. Does that mean the other dragon slayers will be left alone too? He questioned. She nodded. And if what you've explained to me is true, then that means they'll be left alone. Without any sort of explanation as to the sudden reason, he paused for several moments. That seems kind of cruel. I don't know what I'd do if you just up and disappeared without any warning. It is rather cruel, but they wouldn't have choice. Few have the jurisdiction in that world I hold, she replied. You can't tell them either. You have to keep it to yourself. What? You can't tell them, Naruto Uzumaki, she said sternly. Do you understand? I'm not even sure you should let the outside world know that you're a dragon slayer. You could just instead rely on your other magic. It's powerful enough for you to do so. I worry, there will be people watching you and the other dragon slayers too. It'll be dangerous to let them know of who you are, she explained. He gritted his teeth. I understand and I won't tell them. That is something I can promise, but that is all. Keeping things hidden and secret has its place, I know that. But if it comes down to lying about my powers and lying about myself like that, then I will choose the truth. You know what kind of webs lies can weave and the way it can hurt people. You taught me that. I will keep that a secret, but I will not keep myself one. Besides, his takeover magic was a bit of a sore spot for him, reasons he'd never mention. Especially in front of his Ka-san. Besides, he wasn't about to tell her that it may or may not have been around 50% of the reason he didn't want to rely on it only. She smirked. It looks like some of those lessons sunk in after all. Good thing too. I'd hate to think it all went through one ear and out the other. Oh yeah, just tease me after I give an awesome impassioned speech. That's a real ego booster, he replied sarcastically. There was pause in the talking. Both of them just taking the time to enjoy each other's company and the sounds of the night. You should join a guild, she said, breaking the silence. When you leave, you should join one. I think it would be good for you to be around other people like that. Just make sure you join the right one. He hummed in agreement. It'll be weird not having you around though. You're the only person I've ever really known. I suppose it will be strange, she replied. Another silence ensued, this one lasting a bit longer though for different reasons. This time Naruto was building up his courage to ask her a question he'd been wanting the answer to for a long time. Taking a several deep breaths, he turned to face her. Before you go, will you tell me your name? Please, I know I haven't mastered Dragon Force, but I'm so close. You know that I've almost got it to the point where nothing can break my hold on it, and I can get there almost instantly. It would only take me a bit longer to get it right, so please. Please will you tell me your name before you go, he pleaded. She observed him for several seconds, taking in his frozen body, as he held his breath waiting for her answer. Hi, she finally answered. Before I go I will tell you my name, he breathed. Arigato, Ka-san. Wake up, a voice whispered to him in his sleep. Arg, he mumbled, rolling over in his sleep. Naruto, wake up, the voice repeated with a small bump to his shoulder, and the feeling of smooth scales. He whined and attempted to sweat away the offending object and noise. He heard another sigh, then absolute silence. Suddenly his eyes flew open as he found himself swatted painfully into the side of the wall. The hard impact of the rock on the entire front side of his body certainly doing what it had to in order to wake him up. He slowly slid down the side of the wall, leaving a slight indent behind in the surface he'd just impacted. Ka-san, he said, continuing to lie on the floor he'd recently slid down onto. Why'd you wake me up? And in the daytime too, that's just cruel. You know how sleepy I feel during the day ever since I activated the Dragon Force. So why Ka-san? Why, Naruto, do you remember what day it is? She asked in exasperation. I vaguely recall that today was of some sort of importance, but given that it's daytime and I just recently had my head slammed into a rock I think I have some sort of excuse as to why I can't remember at the moment, he replied, lifting the arm with a bit more feeling to go fiddle with one of the hairs on his head. She sighed and looked away. I'm leaving today. He stared at her for several moments before looking away and spoke. How could I forget? Naruto, she said, sounding hesitant for the first time in a very long time. I know, okay. I get that you don't want to go. I mean the fact that you stayed with me longer than my training required is testament to that. It's just seeing you standing there ready to leave really made it hit. You're like a mother to me. I do call you Ka-san for a reason and I've never even been away from you for more than a day. How am I going to take the years ahead then? He spoke softly, sighing though he continued to look at the floor beneath him. Naruto, I'll always be with you in your heart. You know that, she said as she moved over towards him. Hi, he murmured, raising a hand to wipe away the small tear at the corner of his eye. Come on, this is no way to say goodbye to your Ka-san, she said. Yeah, I guess. After all, his voice trailed off before he jumped to his feet, pointing at her with an accusing finger. You owe me a name, she laughed, a roaring sound echoing round the small cave that would have had Naruto rolling round on the cave of the floor, his ears in complete agony if he hadn't grown used to it long ago. I suppose I do, she said, giving him a fanged grin. He responded with his own, his elongated canines glinting in the sunlight. But Ka-san, he said, his voice sounding completely serious. He then pointed outside with a look of despair on his face. Why do you have to leave during the daytime? She raised an eyebrow. I thought it best. Best because? I said so. Ka-san, that's not a. She gave him the look. Hi Ka-san, because you said so. He gave a shaky grin sitting back down. Glad we have an understanding, she said then sighed. I suppose I should be giving you that name now, shouldn't I? He nodded, too afraid saying anything would suddenly make her change her mind. My name, she stopped, and laughed roughly. It's harder to tell you than I thought. It's not even that special, it's just oddly difficult. I suppose I can't really let it get in the way. Well then, Naruto. My name is Margita, Dragon of the Moon and Night. Margita, he repeated, letting the name roll of his tongue. River of the Night? He questioned. She nodded. I'm glad to finally know your name, Ka-san, he said, giving her a smile. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Becoming aware of something she hadn't been before. She'd been worried. All this time, she'd been so afraid that once he learned her real name he'd stop calling her Ka-san. Stop thinking of her the same way. It was illogical, but something she'd feared nonetheless. Arigato, she whispered. For what? He asked, feeling confused. For calling me Ka-san, she replied. He gave her a searching look then spoke. Even if I wasn't born to you, you will always be my Ka-san. The dragon that saved, cared for and raised me. My son, she whispered. He looked at her with wide eyes. I may have never said it to you like you say to me, but that is what you are to me, she said, smiling at him. Water gathered at the corners of his eyes and he quickly reached up a hand to wipe them away. He wasn't about to let her see him cry. No way, but she'd never called him son before. Never acknowledged their bond on that level. Why did it have to be now? Why did it have to be as she was leaving? Why hadn't she overcome her pride and said so? At least, he thought, looking at her, she managed to overcome it at all. I guess I should be going then, she said, standing up and moving towards the entrance of the cave. He nodded and stood up to follow her, stopping as she did just outside the cave. Don't forget to train Naruto. If I find out you haven't been, and trust me, I'll know, then I'll find some way to get you. I may not be able to do it myself, but I'll find a way. Got it, she warned with a dark look. He nodded frantically, even giving her a bow. Hi Ka-san. Good. She looked down at the boy one last time, her harsh look fading into a fond one. Goodbye, Masuko-san. He reached out a hand and gently stroked her snout. Goodbye, Ka-san. Licking his hand with her tongue, she slowly moved away, giving him one last look before she unfurled her wings and took off into the morning sun. Naruto smiled sadly as he watched her fly away, turning back to the cave before a loud voice called out and stopped him. And Naruto! She shouted. Get some clothes. He looked down at his naked form and frowned. Surely, she jested, clothes didn't really exist. They were just a rumor. No sane person would want to put some sort of cloth on their body merely to preserve their modesty. How disgustingly beastly. He shook his head and continued his walk back to the cave. She must be joking, he finally decided as he sat back down on the floor. There was simply no way he was doing that. Muttering to himself, he lay back down on the small mattress at the back of the cave. He wasn't about to join his mother in her brave idea to leave in the daytime, not a chance. He was going to leave when the sun was nice and set, and it was daylight again. A young boy hoped down a mountain at midnight. His pale body illuminated in the moonlight as he casually made his way down the rocky slope. Nearing the bottom, he froze mid-step, his nose picking up an odd scent that didn't mesh with nature at all. It smells old? He thought, reaching a hand up to fiddle with his hair. Yeah, old sounds about right. He sniffed the air again, shifting the overlarge bag slung over his shoulder slightly. I wonder what it is? He wondered aloud. Shrugging to himself, he figured why not, and took off in the direction of the odd smell. After continuing down the mountain, he jogged cautiously for several moments before he came upon a sight that had him frozen. His blood cold like ice. A battlefield, but not just any battlefield, at least that's what his senses told him. He reached a hand up to touch his head as an image flashed through his mind. It looked so much like this location, but it felt so different. He felt like he'd seen this before, or something very much like it. Another image flashed through his mind, this time of a woman with red hair smiling at him. A small trail of blood dripping from the corner of her lips. Is this where his mind trailed off, uncertain how to continue, but he forced himself. His eyes narrowing with certainty as the feeling of déjà vu passed through him. I've been here before because this is where my human Kasan died, he thought as he glared out at the battlefield. These pathetic excuses for human beings killed her, he thought with viciousness as he kicked the nearest fallen body, sending it flying into the distance. It was the first time he'd ever felt such hate, and even Margita's teachings on emotional control weren't helping. He thought he'd moved past his mother's untimely fate. Clearly, he'd been wrong. Stalking through the battlefield, he shamelessly crunched the bones of fallen bodies underneath his feet, taking vindictive joy in their act, even knowing that they were long since dead, and felt nothing from it. Kicking another body out the way, he finally came upon the one he'd been searching for, and his heart stopped before restarting in his chest. Unlike the bodies around him, she wasn't clothed in the same uniform as those that had fallen around her, and another very noticeable thing was that she was perfectly preserved. Honestly, he didn't care at that moment. He cared about very little other than the fallen body of his mother. Her red hair splayed out behind her as he stumbled towards her. Reaching her fallen body, he slid to his knees beside her, dropping his bag to the floor, almost scared to touch her and break whatever held her in such a preserved state. Finally gathering his wits, he sent out his magic, checking all the spells that had been cast upon her person. Margita, he whispered, as he recognized her signature on the spells. He even recognized the spells from some of the books he'd read, though he'd never taken the time to read them. You did this for me, he whispered shakily, tears dripping down from the corners of his eyes. This woman before him was also his mother, although he hadn't been in her care for very long. He had two mothers, the one who had given birth to him, and lay dead and preserved before him. The one from whom he'd inherited his innate magic and who was entirely human. The other who had raised him and who just recently left him. The one who taught him her own form of lost magic and who was one of the most powerful dragons in existence. Arigato, Kasan, he whispered as he reached out to stroke the dark red hair, taking in his first look at another human face. It was strange to look upon such a face and know you were part of the same species, but he didn't linger on it too long. Now was not the time for thinking that way, and to be honest, he couldn't bring himself to look at her that way. As just another human face. Hers was a precious one. Moving forward, he slipped his arms underneath her, lifting the body into his arms. It was only when she was there that he froze as he realized something truly horrific. It can't be, he murmured as he took in her. People really do wear clothes. Shaking his head in shock, he moved away from the battle back towards the mountain, leaping up the cliff swiftly, using magic to boost his steps until he reached the grassy top. Looking round him at the view, he smiled sadly, then returned his gaze to the woman in his arms, unable to control the small rivulets of tears that dripping from the corners of his eyes. Your final resting place under the light of the moon, he murmured as he held her body closer. Feeling a slightly cold metal against his skin, he looked at her closer and noticed a necklace that hung loosely from her neck. Frowning slightly, he shifted his grip on her and gently unclipped it, holding it up by its chain as the pendant glinted in the moonlight. It was oddly beautiful as it shone there. He detected no magic cast upon it other than a faint protection charm. He looked at his mother, an ache in his heart. I'll keep it with me, Kasan, as a reminder of you always, he said with a faint smile. Placing her on the ground gently, he gazed upon her form a few moments longer before turning round and setting about finding a way to bury her, not willing to risk the slow degradation of the preservation charm. Chapter 4. Leaning down to pick up his bag, Naruto paused mid-movement and stood back up. Reaching up a hand to twirl some of the hair near his ear, he looked at the ground, taking in the fallen bodies on the battlefield, and frowned. Apparently he was going to need some form of clothing if he ever hoped to step foot in civilization. He still couldn't believe that humans actually wore clothing. It was just absolutely despicable. However, If he wanted to have any form of interaction with them, then he needed to wear more than just the necklace hanging round his neck. Groaning in despair, he gave in, although he had to admit that where he was about to get the clothing made the whole situation even worse. Searching through dead bodies and stripping them of their clothing was simply not cool on any level. Shifting through several bodies closest to him, he realized it was going to take a lot longer than he thought. Clearly his Kazan had been rather violent when she'd been killing them, because a lot of the clothing looked like nothing more than rags hanging off their skeletons. He supposed he should be grateful though that a lot of the clothing had been spelled with durability so that they lasted longer. Otherwise he might have had to steal some clothes from a village. Muttering and cursing under his breath, it took him until he reached the edge of the circle before he found a mostly intact uniform that looked around his size or close to it. Wrinkling his nose in disgust, he bent down and systematically stripped the figure of its boots, followed by its pants. At least until he noticed there were smaller pants that went to about mid-thigh underneath the larger pants. He stared in fascination. They seemed to be some sort of covering for the man's genitals. How barbaric, he thought with a frown. There was no way he was going to wear those underpants things. It was bad enough that he had to wear any in the first place. He wasn't about to make it worse. Besides, no one would really know if he was wearing them or not. Nodding to himself, he pulled on the pants, grateful that they were rather loose in style. He didn't think he could handle tight pants. The material was irritating enough. Finishing up with that, he nodded to himself in satisfaction before he then turned his gaze to the boots, his gaze narrowing. He glared at them, locked in a one-sided staring contest. No, he said as he stared at them. I refuse to degrade myself to that level. He continued to stare. I refuse, he mumbled. His glare harshened for a moment before he broke his stare. Fine, I'll try, he mumbled. Sitting down, he grabbing one of the dark boots, he yanked it on. He sat there for several moments, taking in the feeling before his entire body froze. In a flash he was on his feet, and the boot nothing but a little speck miles in the distance. Never again! He yelled. Shaking his head in despair, he bent back down again, and yanked the jacket and shirt off the body. He immediately threw the shirt back down after taking a better look at it. He'd observed that it was clearly made to be skin tight, and even if his build was slighter than the body he'd pulled it off, it would still fit him too tight for comfort. Looking at the robe jacket thing, he nearly let it join the shirt on the floor. But after taking it in for several moments, he decided it would probably be best to keep it in case he ended up in some sort of snowstorm, because even if being a dragon slayer made him more resistant to such conditions, you could never be sure. So, with a shrug, he threw it next to his bag. Now he just had to figure out what to do about the fact that the pants he was wearing would trip him if he walked more than 3 steps, because they seemed to hang several inches too long, trailing round his feet. He could just cut them, of course. But that would then limit their lifespan, and when he got taller he'd need to get new clothing, which seemed like way too much effort than he was willing to put into it. I mean, he already had to find pants once. Doing it again would be a pain. Nodding to himself, he stared into space for a few minutes as he tried to come up with an idea. When he eventually came back to himself, no idea forthcoming, he realized what he'd been staring at, and finally an idea popped into his head. You're in note some night claws, he muttered, activating the darker side of his magic, dragon slayer magic, letting the almost invisible darkness shift and elongate around the tips of his finger until he had several long claws protruding several inches out his fingertips. Giving a dark grin as he observed the result of his spell, he then turned his attention to shirt. Who knew he'd be using his magic for something so mundane? Shrugging slightly, he sat down and pulled the shirt towards him, cutting the shirt up into one long strip. When he'd run out of shirt to cut, he'd grabbed another one off the guy next to him and did the same thing. Making sure there was enough leeway in his pants so they allowed him to bend his leg fully back, he began the quick process to fix his little pant leg problem. Now with 2 long strips, he gripping the first one, he began to wrap it round his legs from the ankle up, tying a quick knot with both pieces at about 3/4 of the way to his knee. Grinning at the result, he repeated the process on his other leg. Finally finished, he jumped to his feet. He walked over to his bag, tugging at the pants in irritation. It wasn't as bad as the boots, but he'd be damned if it wasn't annoying as hell. It was daytime. He couldn't believe he was awake in the daytime of all things. It was absolute torture. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, the sun was shining, the birds were singing, like he said. It was torture. The village he had just entered wasn't helping either. They were all so energetic and happy, smiling at one another with those grins on their faces. Well, he assumed they were grins given that he'd never seen any before. It was like they were mocking him with their happiness. It was just cruel. If this was what his mother had to go through every day she trained him during the day in his younger years, then he suddenly felt a wave of sympathy. No wonder she'd seen fit to throw him round like a rag doll, despite the fact that she'd often insisted she wasn't a violent dragon. He blamed the daylight. Clearly it had been messing with her, the godforsaken thing that it was. However, he did have reason for being here. He needed to find out who the best guild in Fiori was and where he could find them, because if he was going to join a guild then it better be a good one, after he somehow managed to procure a map, that is. The question wasn't actually doing that. It was more about how he could go about it, and with his current headache, thinking too much was just troublesome. He contemplated just grabbing the next person to walk past him, shoving them into an alleyway and demanding answers. However, he didn't figure that would exactly endear him to the people of the village, and if he wanted to get a map as well as answers he'd have to try a different way. Well, not so much different as more polite. It was still an urge he had though, made greater only by the fact that he felt surrounded by an alien species. He knew they were all human, himself included, it just really didn't feel that way. They were all so small, like little blobs of pale flesh. He was looking for the nearest and possibly most receptive passerby when he spotted a woman that seemed to be walking through what looked to be the local market. Her basket was mostly empty though, so he assumed she was arriving rather than leaving. Dredging up his pain-induced manners from somewhere deep beyond his headache, he walked up to the woman. Well, at least he assumed she was a woman. From what little he'd managed to glean, men didn't have breasts. "Excuse me, but I'm new in town and I was wondering if you could help me?" he asked. The woman looked him up and down, taking in the young half-dressed teen who seemed to be all arms and legs despite the muscles shown clearly on his lean frame. She decided that although he could perhaps be some sort of pervert with the way he was dressed, but that he wasn't an actually threat. He looked far too tired to be a threat, and she figured she could always outrun the exhausted-looking teen if he tried anything funny. Finally she replied, "It depends on what you need help with." It was certainly a more pragmatic answer than he was expecting, but shrugged it off. The other thing that was harder to shrug off was being directly spoken to by another human, and really hearing their voices for the first time. Yes, he could hear the people talking, but it wasn't directly to him like this. It really was quite strange. He had to resist poking cheek just to check she was real. His odd staring look was broken by a cleared throat. "Are you going to just stand there staring at me all day? Oh Goman, I was wondering if you could perhaps tell me what town I'm and then point me in the direction I might be able to get map from," he replied after another moment's pause of staring at her mouth opening and closing. Were their mouths really that pink on the inside? "You don't know where you are?" she asked, raising a brow. He shook his head. "Really?" He nodded. She sighed. "You're in Wakanai, we're one of the most northern villages in Fiori." "Oh, and a map? There should be one at the small tourist shop up the road. About 10 buildings or so down," explained as she pointed behind her. "Arigato," he said, giving her a small bow before heading off in the direction she pointed. Glad he hadn't done anything deemed stupid in the eyes of humanity. A few buildings down, and several odd looks from the citizens of the town, he spotted what he was looking for and headed towards the small shop that seemed to be filled with all sorts of curios. He walked in and heard a bell ring above the door, nearly giving him heart failure. Who puts bells above doors anyway? He thought with vehemence, as he glared at the gold thing. When he turned back his gaze to the store, he spotted the man he was looking for sleeping behind the counter. He glared with jealousy. How come that man gets to sleep in the day? It's a cruelty that cannot be ignored. Heading over to the counter, he leaned over and tapped the man gently on the cheek to wake him up. At least he thought it was gently. It ended up sending the man flying off his stool and halfway across the store. He was sure he hadn't hit the man that hard. It was barely a tap. He felt slightly concerned. He hadn't accidentally killed the man, had he? That would be horrible to have on his conscience. Walking over to the man, he tapped him with his foot, gently rolling the man over. Aji-san," he said, poking the old man in the side. The man groaned and sat up, blinking for several moments and rubbing his cheek. Realizing he wasn't alone in the shop, he gave Naruto a toothless grin that had the boy feeling just a tad disturbed. It was one thing seeing humans in such large quantities for the first time, but it was another thing entirely to see someone without a decent amount of teeth in his mouth and such a wrinkled face. "Ah, customer. How can I help you, boy?" he asked, climbing shakily to his feet and walking towards the counter. "Well, I was just wondering if you had a map of Fiori?" he asked, deciding to go with the weird flow that had been going on since the man had woken up. "A map, you say? Hi, Aji-san," he replied, giving the man a small bow out of habit. His Ka-san's teach is not something that would fade even with time, a headache or a creepy old man with less teeth than he had eyes. "I'm sure I have one somewhere," he said, disappearing behind the counter. There were several low bangs and curses that Naruto would never have suspected such an old man knew before the man stood back up, an old worn-looking piece of paper in his hand. "It's a bit worn out, but should work just fine." Naruto nodded and took the map from the man. Opening it up, he quickly searched over the page before spotting the village he was currently in right near the top of the page, proving that this was in fact a map of the right place. He wasn't sure how much he trusted the old man's judgment. He gave the man a smile. "Arigato, how much will that be?" "Oh, just 100 jewels, the man replied. Naruto wasn't sure if the man was cheating him of his money or not, given that he knew nothing about pricing, but at that moment he didn't really care. He just wanted the map, and he didn't have much other use for the money his Ka-san had left him. Not that there was much of it. Muttering to himself, Naruto lowered the bag on his back, quickly digging out the required money. "Would you also happen to know what people consider the most powerful mages guild in Fiori?" he asked as he chucked the money on the counter. "Currently Phantom Lord, though there are some up-and-coming guilds," he replied. "Phantom Lord, huh?" he repeated. "The name sounds cool, definitely badass," he thought, considering it for a moment longer before he shook his head. "No, they must be compensating for something with a name like that. What would Ka-san if she heard of me being in guild like that?" "What about these up-and-coming guilds?" he asked, tucking the map into his pocket. "Well, there are several guilds known to be doing quite well, though there is a rumor going round about one of them," said the old man as he took his place back on the stool. Naruto raised an eyebrow, surprised that the sleepy man seemed so well informed. "Which one?" he asked. Fairy tale, he replied. There's a rumor going round that they're nearly as strong as Phantom Lord these days, or at least they've got some new young mages to help them get there. He hummed in thought. Fairy tale. It sounded interested enough. Shaking his head slightly, he looked at the old man who was gazing at him with interested eyes. Well, I best be going. Arigato for the help, Aji-san, he said, giving the man a smile before leaving the shop as fast as politeness allowed. The old man chuckled as the boy left, watching his figure move down the street. It had been a while since he'd seen one of them. He wasn't aware they still trained students. I wonder what kind of whirlwind you'll bring to Fiori, he murmured, one hand twirling his hair round his finger, the other tracing the different places on the map that Naruto gazed at with a frown on his face. If what he was looking at was correct then, he swore under his breath, if only he'd headed south. If he'd headed south then he could have already been on his way to Fiori, but no. He had to be an idiot and head north. Well, he supposed he wouldn't have found his mother if he hadn't done so, but it didn't really soothe his irritation. Plus it was still daytime, where his emotions only seemed to consist of irritation and exhaustion. His Ka-san hadn't warned him that this would be a side effect when he'd managed to activate the dragon force, and used it a lot, though he was beginning to doubt she even knew it at all. With a sigh he stuffed the map back on his pocket, and looked in the direction he was going to head. Literally, he couldn't even bring himself to think about working the terrain to his advantage or nothing. He was going to be heading straight in one direction, and he was going to do it now. He really just couldn't take it anymore. He wanted to get there as quickly as possible, and he wasn't going to dawdle and enjoy the scenery. He may have felt exhausted, but he was going to leave right now, right after he took a nap under the trees. The sun was just too much, and the shade really did help calm him down even if it didn't get rid of the exhaustion. Folding up the map, he stuffed it back into his pocket before grabbing the robe looped round his bag, bundling it up, and placing it at the base of the tree. I knew it would come in handy, he thought fondly. Smiling slightly to himself, he placed his head on the pillow bundle and promptly passed out, the shade of the tree flickering shadows and sunlight across his face. If there was one thing he was grateful for, though, it was his ability even in sleep to know when the sun had set so accurately he could tell you the second the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon. It was that which woke him up with a jolt. His shaggy hair spiked up like a halo of pale blonde round his head. Shaking his head, he gazed round him in confusion as he rubbed his eyes, blinking several times as he stared at his surrounds. It took a few moments before the light bulb went off in his head and he remembered where he was. Jumping to his feet, he quickly dug through the bag, pulling out some of the dried meat his Ka-san had made him for the journey. Biting into a piece, he looked at what he had left and frowned. He'd definitely have to hurry up if he didn't want to starve. Sure, he could stop at a village and get some, but he wasn't exactly swimming in money. He was quite sure Margita had a skewed view of prices, considering she'd last been in the world properly hundreds of years ago. At least he thought so. She'd said the money had belonged to her last dragon slayer, and according to the dates that was a long time ago. He also considered the price of the map compared to the money she'd given him. It wasn't much. She made out as if she'd given him enough money to live off for years. Well, she was wrong. Until he joined a guild and started making money, he was going to be a bit short on cash and food. Grumbling to himself as he chewed of the piece of dried meat, he wrapped the robe back round the pack before shouldering it and looking up at the sky. The sun hadn't set too long ago, so you could only see the beginnings of stars in the sky. Even so, the feeling was already beginning to fill him. Grinning despite his money problems, he gathered in the ambient energy of the night before muttering a quick spell, Suki no Taiju, weight of the moon. Immediately a feeling of weightlessness filled him, and he shook himself slightly to get used to the feeling. The spell he'd used wasn't actually much use in battle unless you had a lot of experience with it. It took a lot of refined control to use correctly. It was originally just used to lessen the force of gravity on the user. However, the previous Dragon Slayer had been able to come up with a way to manipulate it rather than just lessen it one way. That made it a lot more useful in battle than it was previously, allowing free manipulation rather than continuously having to turn the technique off and on, which cost a lot more energy. He just found it annoying that he couldn't use it on someone else. That was unfortunately a technique that he didn't have, but he was looking into it even if it was little success. Shrugging off his thoughts, he jumped into the sky, aiming more forward than up, though he easily cleared the trees. Reaching what he considered an adequate distance, he then increased the gravity on his body and dropped down quickly. It would be odd to anyone who witnessed his landing, though, because even with the increase in gravity he still landed lightly and silently on his feet. Feeling the grass tickle his toes, he shifted his stance, lessened the gravity again, and shot off into the distance. He wished the technique would allow him to fly, but it didn't have the right kind of influence, and he wasn't a wind mage. He was looking for a way around that, and had experienced some success. It wasn't perfected, however, and he wasn't willed to risk messing up and injuring himself when there wasn't anyone to help him. Still, he was so tempted right now just to speed up the process. In fact, he cursed the lessons his mother had drilled into his head. If she hadn't, then he was sure he wouldn't have been so cautious and would have been okay with trying it out. But no, it was stuck in his mind forever. Curse you, Ka-san, he mumbled. Chapter 5. Naruto swore. He couldn't believe that in only a few days he had already been forced to stay outside during the daytime. It was beyond annoying. He supposed it would have been more so if not for the fact that there was a good reason both times. The reason for this one being the giant orange door he was staring at. He'd come there last night, hoping they'd be open, but he'd been most unfortunately wrong. To be fair to them, though it had been around 1 in the morning, he was sure that most guilds wouldn't be open at that time. Muttering under his breath, he silently pushed the large orange door open. He found himself oddly liking the color, and sliding inside with hardly a sound. He took a quick glance over the room, noting the largely wooden interior and bright colors that decorated what seemed like some kind of food hall. The atmosphere was quite warm if a bit loud, and were it not daytime he probably would have had better appreciation for the familial feel about the room. As it was, he was only grateful he wasn't standing outside anymore. It really did make a difference. Looking over the room a second time in search of someone to ask for the Gilded Master, he spotted a boy who he guessed was about 2 years older than himself sitting at the bar. There were other kids younger than himself, but he didn't figure they'd be much help in this situation. Twirling a piece of hair between his fingers, he slouched over to the boy, his bare feet not making a sound on the floor. He slid into the seat next to the boy and raised a hand. Yo! The blonde-haired teen nearly jumped out of his skin at the sound of the unfamiliar voice next to him. Spinning round in his seat, he took note of the pale boy sitting next to him. He then realized that the boy was dressed rather oddly, given that he was missing his shirt and his shoes. Never mind the odd way he'd wrapped material round the bottom of his pants. "Oh hail," he greeted hesitantly. The boy looked back at him after the returned greeting, though he continued to fiddle with his hair. "Can you tell me where I can find that master of this place?" he asked. Laxus raised an eyebrow. What does this kid want with the old man? Maybe. Why, are you interested in joining? Hi, he replied quite simply. "Oh, a newcomer is it?" said a voice behind them. Twirling round in his seat, he came face to face with one of the shortest men he had ever seen. To be fair to the old man, he hadn't seen too many people in his life, but still, even he was aware the man was tiny. Naruto was surprised, though, that he hadn't felt the man approach. He had good senses, something being a dragon slayer had granted him. To be unable to detect him was odd. He blinked at him several times. "Are you aware that you are an incredibly short man?" The guild master nearly fell off the bar. "Yes, I'm aware." "You think I lived my whole life being unaware of it?" "Well, if you'd grown up in a village where everyone was the same height as you and no one else ever visited, then yes, I would assume you were unaware of your situation," he said as he looked at the man on the bar. "Are you saying that just to mess with me, or do you seriously think that?" he asked as he took another swing of alcohol from his bottle. "Both," was the deadpan reply. They stared at each other for several seconds until the old man laughed. Laxus shook his head, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Clearly the teen didn't know who he was talking to. He might be relaxed with his grandfather now, but if actually who he was, he'd no doubt turn into another awe-inspired little fanboy. Well, maybe fanboy was a bit harsh of him. The kid didn't look the type, but he was sure he'd be awe-inspired anyway. "What's your name, kid?" his grandfather asked after he stopped laughing. "Naruto Uzumaki, at your service," the pale teen replied after a moment's hesitation. "You, here it comes," thought Laxus. "Makarov Dreyer," he replied, giving the youth a big grin. The boy accepted the name with a nod. "Nothing? Not even a twitch to indicate he's familiar with the name? Has this kid been living under a rock?" Laxus mentally exclaimed. "I'm also the guild master here," he added after taking several long gulps of his drink. Out of the corner of his eyes, Makarov noticed the necklace the boy wore. Why would he be wearing a necklace from that guild? But they'd been disbanded a while back and the boy looked too young to have been a member. Besides, he looked interested in joining Fairy Tail. He pushed such thoughts from his mind. Now that knowledge certainly got the boy's attention. The hand that had been twirling his hair froze and he looked at Makarov with a raised brow, now knowing how he'd snuck up on him. "Are you being serious or just saying that to mess with me?" Makarov chucked the wooden tankard at him. Ducking to the side, Naruto grinned. "So, you were being serious," he joked. The old man jumped to his feet. "Yes, I was being serious." Even Laxus laughed then. However, his laughter and the guild master's shouting was enough to attract the attention of the guild members, the younger ones mostly. The older ones decided it would be best to stay out of it and find out later on. Ultimately, they were just too lazy to get up and ask. A girl with red hair and a plate of chest armor on looked up from the table she was sitting at when she heard the laughter. It wasn't too often something got Laxus laughing. She frowned, wondering what caused it. That is, until she noticed something she'd completely overlooked. There was a boy sitting next to him. How she'd managed to completely overlook him was something she couldn't understand. He appeared to be about a year or two older than her, with a long lean build, though it was clear he was in the middle of a growth spurt. His chest and feet were completely bare, leaving him in only a pair of pants. She shuddered and prayed he wasn't another Gray. She wasn't sure she could handle another stripper. Standing up from her lone spot at the table, she made to walk over to the master, only to find her pathway blocked mid-walk by none other than the stripping boy she'd been thinking about only moments earlier. "Gray, master!" he shouted. "Who's the half-naked kid?" Urza raised a brow. Like he's one to talk, she thought, and he really shouldn't talk to the master that way. Raising a hand, she smacked him on the head from behind, sending him flying into the wall. Catching her movement, the pale boy immediately turned his head towards her and stared for several moments, with an odd look on his face. She was unaware he'd been surprised by her similar appearance to his human mother. Especially the hair. However, he seemed to become aware of the fact that he was staring and gave her a grin in apology. What are you smiling about? She asked, feeling a bit indignant over his odd reaction. There weren't many people who would smile about one child sending another flying into a wall, and she was pretty sure most of them were in fairy tale. Nothing really, you just reminded me of my cousin for a moment, he replied, not that she knew he was referring to both. One for the hair color, and the other for her violent streak. The redhead gave him a look somewhere between a scowl and confusion before turning her attention back to Makarov. Master, who's the stranger? He said, his name's Naruto, seems interested in joining the guild. She turned her attention back to Boy, who now had his head resting on the bar, and seemed much more interested in fiddling with his hair than anything they were talking about. Frowning, she turned her attention back to Makarov. Are you going to let him, master? The old man shrugged and chugged back some more of the drink in his tankard before replying. I see no reason not to. Shouldn't you test his power first? Asked Gray, having recovered from his Urza-induced wall slam. Makarov raised a brow. Did you or Urza have to? No, master, replied Gray sulkily, folding his arms. He just wanted to see the guy's magic. Was that so bad? He doesn't have to anyway. He can probably sense my magic. It's a skill most mages put in the effort to learn, especially powerful ones, said Naruto from his slouched position. Which is probably why he didn't test either of you when you joined the guild. Oh, said Gray, feeling surprised. The teen's answer made sense though. Makarov never tested anyone's magic when they entered the guild, seeming to just know their magical power, and even some of their abilities. He must be good at this sense thing, he thought. Gray. Kana! Shouted Makarov, nearly scaring Gray out his last piece of clothing. A small girl with brown curls hanging either side of her face looked up from the cards she was busy placing on the table to scan the room. Finding Makarov, the source of the shout, she quickly shuffled her cards back together and hurried over, smoothing out the invisible creases on her orange dress. Master? She inquired once she'd reached them, her gaze shifting occasionally to the newcomer among them. Can you get the guild stamp for me? He asked. Her eyebrows rose as she nodded, taking one last look at the pale boy relaxing with his head on the bar before heading off to find the stamp. Quickly locating it, she headed back over, rubber stamp clasped in her hand. Unfortunately for Gray, she arrived just in time to stop Naruto answering his question about what kind of magic he used. Urza had also been interested in hearing the answer, though she'd never admit it, and found herself having to resist challenging Kana to a fight. She would have punished the girl from preventing her receiving the answer. Here, master, said the dark-haired girl with a smile. He looked at the guild stamp in Kana's hands for a moment before looking back at the girl and giving her a smile. Why don't you do it, Kana? Me? She asked in surprise. Sure, anyone with a fairy tale mark is capable of marking another with the stamp, he explained. Oh, okay, she murmured, turning to face the pale newcomer. So, where would you like it? Like what? He asked, lifting his head up and rubbing his eyes. Kana frowned in confusion. Your stamp? Weren't you listening? Not really, he replied, playing with a piece of hair close to his eyes. Oh, he had been listening, but it was better they thought he hadn't been. That way at a later stage he was more likely to overhear people saying things without paying him much attention. Noticing Urza looked like she was about to turn her wrath on the teen, she quickly intervened with an explanation. Your official guild mark. Everyone who joins a guild receives a mark to show they are a member of that guild. He thought about it for a bit before nodding and turning round. Right shoulder blade on my back. Color? She asked. You can pick that? He asked, spinning back round on his stool. She nodded. Oh, I'll take black anyway, he replied, starting to spin round before stopping, seeming to realize something. Hopping off the stool, he gave Kana a quick smile and knelt down so she could have easier access to his back. Arigato, she muttered before marking his back with the official insignia. It glowed and shimmered briefly before settling on his back. Waiting for a few more seconds, Naruto stood back up, giving the smaller girl a grin before settling back on the bar, his head resting on it sleepily. He doesn't seem particularly excited about it, said Urza as she looked at the tall boy. Seems pretty tired to me, replied Laxus. Probably too exhausted to show much enthusiasm, though they'd soon learn his attitude wasn't a one-time thing. As soon as the sun's last rays disappeared beyond the horizon, Naruto felt it. Like his spirit that had previously been chained was now free from the constraints the sun put upon it. Shaking his limbs to free them from the last straggles of fatigue, he jumped to his feet. Energy now flowing through his veins. All right, mission time, he said with a grin. Going on a mission? Asked Laxus as he walked past. Hi, he replied with nod. Want some company? Naruto paused and thought about it for a moment before shaking his head. I'm fine. Sure, but before you go, there's probably someone you should meet, he said. Oh, who? We got a new member today, while you were sleeping, Laxus replied. Naruto paused for a moment. Should he not? He looked at Laxus and shrugged. I'll meet them when I come back. You sure? Could be someone interesting, he said teasingly. Naruto waved him off. He could hear the hinting tone in Laxus's voice, but didn't care to pay it too much attention. He could meet them when he came back, easily enough. It wasn't like they'd just wander off and join a new guild while he was gone. Besides, he had too much to do, or at least he would when he picked out a mission from the board. Then he had to go and do the mission. After which he could get down to some training. If it wasn't for the fact that he needed money to survive, he wouldn't even bother doing missions, and would just continue his training constantly. He was so close to perfecting the Dragon Force state he could practically taste it. Unfortunately, perfection remained elusively out of his grasp. Shrugging off his annoyance with his recent lack of progress, he turned his gaze to the board, scanning over the list of mission requests until one caught his attention from the corner of his eye. It was stuck right up on the left-hand corner of the board in an out-of-the-way place. Reaching up a hand, he grabbed the mission and looked it over, his eyes immediately checking to the money being offered. His brows nearly jumped off his head and he had to check again just to be sure. 10 million jewels is a lot of money, he thought with a raised brow. Checking the difficulty rating, he nodded his head, the offering making a bit more sense. It was A-class in difficulty, which was only a step away from S-class. He was just glad the downstairs board was spelled to keep people from seeing missions considered above their abilities. Otherwise there would be people getting killed off left and right. Checking the sponsor, he almost reconsidered taking the mission when he saw who it was. The council. But why send the mission out to the guilds? He thought with a frown. He knew for a fact that the council usually used the Rune Knights to do any missions they required. He was curious now. Why would they ask a guild to do their work? It even mentioned on the request that utmost discretion would be needed. It was clearly something they didn't want well known, but it also wasn't put on the S-class board, which meant it wasn't overly difficult. In fact, he considered that it might only be given A-class ranking because of the pay and the fact that it was from the council, not that it really mattered. He was too interested now. He wanted to know what it was that the council wanted kept hidden, and what it had to do with the Bureau of Magical Development. First he had to meet the client, which was unsurprisingly the council. Apparently they had more information to give him regarding the mission, which was a good thing too because there wasn't much information on the request. Just that they needed help with something to do with the Bureau of Magical Development. Knocking on the door, he took the time to get a better look at his location. He'd never been there before, but the height of the Magic Council's location certainly provided a well enough view. He'd also expected the place to be a lot bigger, not that it was small by any means. It even had its fair share of orange, a color he was growing rather fond of. But even if the place was big enough to crush Fairy Tail with only a small corner of the building, he'd expected it to be so big it would only take a pillar of the place to crush Fairy Tail. Though he supposed that it was only the Fiori branch, not the main one. It was a okay-looking place, though he'd probably have had better thoughts on it, if the time of day hadn't required the sun to be out and shining in his face. He heard footsteps coming and quickly spun round to face the door. Thinking quick, he pulled his magic forth. Suki no Kuraiso Kumin, dark side of the moon, he muttered under his breath. It was better to be safe than sorry. As far as he knew, any body of great political power only spelled trouble. A glowing white magic circle appeared both above and below his body. A wave of first silver then black seemed to shimmer over his body before slowly fading away. His body tingled slightly at the use of magic, but he shook it off with a shrug of his shoulders. The towering door then opened a small crack. The head of a frog-like creature popping round the door. He'd been told the Magic Council employed some odd creatures, but he never thought they'd been telling the truth. "Who are you?" asked the creature. Naruto was surprised it could speak at all. "Naruto Uzumaki, a mage of Fairy Tail, answering the council's recent mission request," he replied, quickly showing it the guild mark on his back. Not sure if he should give any details on the mission, or if he should keep that from the servant. However, it seemed his answer had been clear enough. The frog-like humanoid opened the door wide enough for Naruto to slip inside before closing it abruptly behind him. "Follow me," she had said, leading him through the towering building. Keeping pace with the creature, Naruto did his best to keep track of where it led him in case he needed to make a quick getaway, though he hoped it didn't come to that. Feeling a nervous shiver go down his spine, he steeled his nerves and hurried his pace, tapping footsteps echoing round the high-ceiling hallways. After what felt like an eternity of twisting routes, the humanoid finally bade him stop, and he halted his steps outside another large door that curved up into a pointed arch. "Please wait here a moment," said the creature as it entered the room, presumably to announce his presence. Taking the time to steel his nerves, Naruto observed the area he was waiting in, noting the almost open feel granted by the railings. It was an oddly comforting feeling. Being so high up really did remind him of home. Fiddling with a piece of shaggy hair, he walked over to the railing and whistled when he looked over the edge. It was a long way down. Hearing footsteps on the other side of the door, he returned to his previous spot. The door opened wide enough to let him through before once again closing quickly behind him. There was definitely something odd going on. Normally big doors were put there for big dramatic entrances, not so that people can slip in and out with barely anyone noticing. Looking round the room, he noticed no one, but a dark figure whose face was shadowed by a dark pointed hat keeping his identity hidden. Still, Naruto felt it best be safe and send out his magical senses in case anyone was hiding undetected. "You can stop that, I assure you we are the only ones here," said the dark figure. Naruto's head snapped in his direction. This man was powerful. It was one thing to detect a person's magical signature, even the power they used as their main magic, but it was another thing entirely to be able to detect when someone was sending out their magical senses. Halting his actions, Naruto walked closer towards the man, stopping a respectable distance away, giving a small bow. "Naruto Uzumaki, a member of Fairy Tail Guild," Naruto introduced, knowing it was unlikely he'd get an introduction in return, but still offering it nonetheless. "One of Makarov's brood, eh?" "Makes no difference. You answered the request and therefore understand the discretion we require for this mission," said the tall man. Naruto nodded. I will be asking you to take a magical oath keeping what you discover a secret. You understand what that requires, do you not? Naruto paused for a moment, but there was no chance he was turning back. His curiosity had been piqued, and while he'd heard curiosity killed the cat, they never mentioned it killing the Naruto. He almost snickered at the thought, it was so lame, but the seriousness of the situation kept him silent. He nodded to show his acceptance of the man's terms. Hi. Good, I'm glad we understand each other. Now let me explain what you will be required to do. Chapter 6. Everything about the night should have added up to it being a good night. After all, the sun had set long ago, there wasn't a cloud in the sky, leaving the full moon on clear display, and the air was nice and cool just the way he liked it. Yes, all in all it should have added up to a good night. There was just one little thing preventing it from being so, and that was the fact that he was running through the middle of the desert. Well, it wasn't so much a desert as it was a dry, rocky, sandy place. Still, the similarities were close enough for the same problems to arise. Even then, it wasn't so much that he was running in the middle of a desert that was the problem. No, he quite enjoyed running, especially when he cast the light Tsuki no Taiju weight of the moon to lighten the gravity enough so that if he changed his stride to push forward more than up, and the gravity wasn't lightened too much where he'd end up flying into the sky or just plain floating off the ground. No, he quite liked that. In fact, he didn't mind the desert so much either, it wasn't too bad. What he really hated about it, what really ruined his night, was the sand. It could mean he'd hate the desert, but he didn't, it was quite beautiful. He just hated the sand in the desert. He was beginning to despise its very existence. Since he'd entered the desert-like place, it had gotten everywhere. In his clothes, in his hair, in his eyes, in his mouth, and much to his irritation, underneath his fingernails, which was far more irritating than it sounded. It buffeted against him with the wind, stinging his skin like a concentrage that made him wish he knew fire magic so he could burn all the sand in the desert till it turned to glass. He was determined to avoid all future missions that might lead to his return to the godforsaken place. In fact, if this mission wasn't so important and classified, he might have turned back, given the request back to the client, told him he failed, and be on his merry way home. Yes, it sounded like an absolutely brilliant plan, but he highly doubted the council would appreciate it. Even so, the council's odd request was enough to keep him interested despite his newfound hatred. Apparently, contact over the last 2 years between the Magic Council and the Bureau of Magical Development had been spotty. Reports hadn't reached them or had been very vague in what they were requesting. Then reports had gradually decreased in frequency until they'd stopped coming altogether. However, due to the infrequency of the reports, it had taken them about 4 months to realize another report wasn't coming. That had been about a year ago. He wasn't entirely sure why they'd taken so long to contact someone, or even just themselves, and gone to check what was wrong. Maybe they were afraid of someone who had been there or something like that. Maybe they were scared of the place, period. Which would really suck for him then. If the council is scared of someone or something, then there's generally a good reason why. If they were afraid of going there in case they lost their lives, then they probably felt the same way about the Rune Knights in their service. He suspected he was correct, which meant that the only reason they'd hired him was because they had no problem with another mage losing their life. But he was going to do it anyway. He was never one to listen to naysayers and such things. Margita had once told him he couldn't smash a rock using only his head. He might have walked away with his head swollen to twice the size, but he'd done it eventually. So, he wasn't about to let their fear affect his ability to do the mission. After all, it was ranked A-class, not S-class. If it was ranked S-class, he would have rethought his course of action. It was also classified as investigation, not as an all-out war against the place. That made him feel at least a little better about it. They wanted him to investigate the reason the place had halted their communication. They suspected it had either been commandeered by someone outside the law or had been destroyed in the same manner. He hoped it was the latter. Whilst he certainly enjoyed a good fight, he wasn't exactly looking for a bunch of criminals to destroy him. They'd probably be very powerful too. The council had given him notes about the man who'd been or possibly was still in charge of the place. If the place had been commandeered by criminals, then that meant that he'd been defeated. That would mean the person who defeated him was S-class mage powerful. If he had full control over the dragon force, then he wouldn't worry, but that was unfortunately just out of reach. Without it, his power was only near S-class, but not quite there. Especially with his takeover magic issues. Noticing an odd shape in the distance, he pushed such wonderings from his mind to try and get a better look at it. From what he could estimate given his directions and location, it was probably the place that he was looking for. Not that he could see much from this distance. Even if being a dragon slayer increased his senses, his eyesight still wasn't enough to get a good look. Feeling slightly irritated by his inability to see it, he dared to speed up ever so slightly, careful to adjust his stride so as to not send himself tripping face first into the dirt. And with the speed he was going at, it would be a face-grinding painful trip indeed. With his increased speed, he was soon close enough to get a better look at it, his eyes widening slightly at the odd shape. It was definitely tall, that much was clear. Most of the buildings seemed to be glowing a bright white color under the moon, though he could see hints of twisting red pipes that seemed to stand out from the building. What was really something to marvel at, though, was the odd shape of the building, the almost shell-like structure on the left-hand side curving up into a quarter-moon shape, or at least that was the shape it had taken previously. It looked misshapen now. That in itself made him want to like the place, but there was a sinister feel about the building that prevented any feeling of fondness or familiarity. Instead, he felt a shiver crawl up his spine and his steps slowing down the closer he got. The magic felt so cold and empty. It wasn't dark, for he'd always claimed a closeness to darkness. It was just such if he'd had to put it into words he'd say that the magic felt angry, like an icy cold rage that crawled under your skin. Thousands of little bugs that scratched and bit at your very insides. He'd never known magic could feel like that. He'd obviously been taught about it, but to feel it was another thing. What made it worse was his increased sensitivity to not only other mages' magic, but to the actual Eternano in the environment. While usually a useful ability, it now set his teeth on edge and had his magic swirling inside him. Instinctively it wanted to react to the threat the magic presented. Dragon Slayer magic by nature felt wilder than most, and as he just learned it, acted wilder too. Even so, he could feel his takeover magic acting up too, though he supposed given its nature it was in itself was also quite wild magic. Now, he was paying the price on both fronts. The magic felt as if it had been violated. Bent against its nature. He nearly threw up at the feeling. Desperately swallowing back the bile that had risen in his throat, he pushed the feeling aside. Now wasn't the time to get into a hurling fit until he was lying in a pile of his own vomit. 1, because he had a mission to do, and 2, because he had no way to clean himself afterwards. Up close now he noticed several things he hadn't recognized from afar, like the fact that it looked like the building had been snapped almost in half, which explained his earlier thought on its misshapen appearance. Parts of it blackened and lying in ruins on the floor. It didn't really matter though, because he'd been given a second set of orders beyond just investigation. Should the place still be standing, then he was to destroy it. That they'd actually said was more important than even finding out what happened. He was to destroy all evidence of the place and basically eradicate its very existence. It was clear to him that the council had definitely been involved in some sort of unscrupulous activity with this place. Why else would they not send the Rune Knights? Clearly they wanted to keep what had gone on here a secret, and the vow they'd had him take would assure that. That aside, he had a mission to do. So, putting all thoughts to rest, he observed the building, hoping it would give him some kind of idea on what was the best entry point. The most conventional and obvious route would be to go from the bottom and work his way up. But that honestly seemed like it would be more pain than it was worth. There was also the fact that the building may extend underground, which meant he would have to go down first, then back up the way he'd gone previously to continue going up. He could start from the top and work his way down, but in the end that would take just as much time because he'd have to travel the same distance to get back out anyway. However, it seemed like a less obvious entry point, and there was therefore less chance that the place would be guarded for entry at the top than the bottom. Yes, going through the top seemed best. He'd look into destroying it later. Lessening the gravity on his body, he jumped up. Launched himself high into the air until he landed lightly, looking far too much like a ballerina for his own taste on the tip of building. Steadying his footing, he stepped off the edge and slowly floated down onto a more flat surface where he released the spell. Settling himself after the weight increase, he took a moment to search his surrounds for a roof entrance. However, he quickly noted that the people who'd previously stayed here hadn't been kind enough to make one. Shaking his head, he muttered a quick spell under his breath. You're a note some night claws. He immediately felt the effects of the spell as he worked with his magic to mold night outside his body. A magical pressure speared through the bones of his fingers like an almost pleasant chill until it was forced out, protruding from the tips of his fingers as swirling dark mass only to condense, and seemingly hardening into claws that protruded about 3 inches from the tips of his fingers. Grinning toothily at his handwork, he set to work cutting a hole for an entrance. He was well aware he could have just blasted his way in, but it would have been a waste of magic as well as alert everyone if anyone was around to his presence. First things first though. He sent out his magical senses to the area below his feet in order to sense if anyone was around. It actually made him wince when he felt the cold magic brush against his senses, putting a foul taste in his mouth and setting his teeth on edge. Still, he moved past that and searched the room for any magical signatures. Unfortunately, his aversion to the magic in the air made it harder to sense anyone, especially since he was sure their magic would feel similar to the Eternano here. Still, from what he could gather, there wasn't anyone close by. Squatting down, he quickly carved his claws through the white metal surface, being careful to be as silent as possible. Peeling back the metal like an old tin can, he jumped down, landing lightly on his feet. Quickly spinning in a smooth circle, he checked to be sure he hadn't missed anyone, not wanted to be taken out just because he was too lazy to be cautious. Seeing no one, though, he relaxed his stance and released the spell that had created his claws. Now that he'd checked the area for enemies, he took better look around at where he'd landed in the first place. From what he could see, he'd landed in some sort of office, though the design was something he was unfamiliar with. There was also the fact that given the building's half collapse, he was using a wall as a floor. It made it hard to discern where he was because of the way some of the objects had been thrown about, but the way the room and objects were designed seemed to be all curved and rounded at the edges. The cold colors and feel of the room, that combined with the violated Eternano in the air, really gave him the creeps. However, there did seem to be an upside to where he'd landed. If what he could guess about all people in charge was correct, then there was a strong possibility he was standing in the office of the man who'd been in charge. He supposed there were pluses to coming in from the top rather than having to work his way up there. This was definitely the place he wanted to be if he wanted information on what was going on here. Stalking towards the most obvious place to keep things in his opinion, he jumped over the desk and landed lightly on the other side. With nothing on the surface but a few burn marks, he assumed the guy had kept his things in the desk drawers. Nodding to himself, he quickly gripped the handle on one, only to suddenly find himself being electrocuted. Volts of electricity sparking through his entire frame as his back arched and his eyes bulged out while he stood frozen in absolute agony. It lasted for a full 10 seconds before stopping briefly, though he guessed it was to quickly recharge because he could already feel the magic building again. Letting go quickly, he stumbled back, gasping for breath as phantom shocks of pain still racked through his body. Faint sparks of blue still crackling up occasionally. Come on, Naruto, focus, he mentally chastised himself. He couldn't believe he'd been stupid enough not to check the desk for traps, especially runic ones. Margita had warned him about falling into traps like that, knowing they were hard to escape. He was just lucky this set required a charging time. The only thing that indicated to him was that whoever had set the runes wasn't at a master level yet. It was also quite clearly not the creator's innate magic, rather being one they'd learned in their own time. It did not, however, elevate any of the pain and stupidity he was feeling at that time. He was disappointed with himself. But his mother had said he'd need experience to better himself and learn. This was obviously one of those things he needed to learn about. Mistakes, as she'd said, were what taught you not to do. She wouldn't have been too angry at him. If he made the same mistake twice, though, he'd find himself on the receiving end of one powerful swat that would send him flying into the distance. He didn't even want to think about what had happened the one time he made the same mistake 3 times. It was an event better left alone. It may have been an odd thing to remember in the middle of a mission, but doing so had restored part of his faith in himself. Nodding grimly to himself, he stood up from where he'd fallen, a determined look on his face. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. Walking back over to the desk, he made sure not to touch anything in case he set another trap or even the same one off. He didn't know a lot about runes. Just enough to get by, which meant he would be able to make or break anything simple, or if he knew the person's magic well enough. Even knowing the basics was beyond a lot of people, but Margita wanted him to know the basics of the more commonly known and used magics, especially magics that couldn't just be overcome with power. Apparently she didn't want him to die just because he didn't know something, which could have just happened. Get over it, he scolded. Muttering to himself, he knelt down in front of the desk and sent out his magic, this time searching for hidden runes. That was the unfortunate, or fortunate depending on who you were thinking about them. If you weren't searching for them specifically, then they would be completely overlooked until activated. You had to be aware of their existence to find them. Feeling out the runes around the desk, he detected 2 other traps plus the one he'd already set off on the desk drawers. Like the one he'd just been electrocuted by. They were both activated by placing your hand on any surface of the drawer or the area surrounding it. What surprised him was that they were actually made strong enough to kill someone without magic in their system. Being a mage strengthened your body beyond a normal human capacity, and as far as he knew, being a dragon slayer had effects on your body that stretched that effect even further. He suspected they had originally been made strong enough to kill another mage, but had weakened over time. Unless runes were designed a specific way, then they deteriorated over time. It was an indication to him that clearly the man who'd been in charge had either not put much effort into making them or had had someone weaker do it for him. From what he'd read on the man's profile, he was very capable with runes, and should have been able to make them that way quite easily. He was grateful that the man had been lax. He wasn't good enough to free himself from something like that. Other than that, though, the magic seemed within his capabilities to break. It just depended on how he decided to go about it. He could take the easy, but more magically intensive route, which involved simply overpowering and overloading the runes until they collapsed. It was only an option because the runes had weakened, otherwise he never even considered trying that. The other route, which was generally the one he chose, would be to find the key point in the runes that would allow him to deactivate them. It would take more time, but was more practical and less likely to leave him with a shortage of magical power. The part of him that really just wanted to know what was inside the drawers said fuck taking your time, and just blast the things open. It also meant he wouldn't have to feel the horrible magic as long as he would if he went the other route. The other half, the more logical side of himself that Margita had cultivated, insisted he be cautious. He didn't know what might pop up later on, so while it may take more time, he should find the key and save his magic. Staring at the runes a few moments longer, his shoulders slumped as he finally caved to logic. Damn you, Ka-san, he thought with a vengeance. Sending out his magic, he gently let it enter the runic construct, slithering between the holes in the man's defense. While his creation was powerful for sure, it only used basic runes and therefore had several holes in defense he could break through. Scowling as he felt his magic surge through the runes, he felt a mild irritation sweep through him. It wasn't a particularly powerful emotion, more a feeling of irritation about his lack of ability to handle the runes in the best way possible. If he knew enough about them, then he would simply be able to rewrite the runes and slip through quite easily. If they were just a little bit better, Naruto wouldn't even be able to use this method. Even if the man who had made the runes hadn't been too good, he was still above Naruto's level of competence with runes, and therefore out his range. It was something he had to fix eventually. There just constantly seemed like a never-ending list of things he had to fix and do. He wondered if he would ever get round to it all. He felt as if he always had so much to fix and never enough time to do it. It was why people didn't focus on too many different types of magic. Shaking his head, he gave his full attention back to his magic, letting the small tendrils seep through and do their work. When his muscles felt like they were starting to cramp and he was about to shift positions, he froze as he finally found what he'd been looking for. Grinning slightly, he felt the magic slowly shift and change that stupid key point, letting the runes shine briefly before fading. Heading back to the desk he'd originally been electrocuted by, he pulled it open, excited by what he might find, only to see nothing. He almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. It was infuriating at a level beyond infuriating. Moving to the next drawer, he pulled it open only to once again find nothing. There better be soothing in this next drawer, he muttered as he yanked it open. He nearly jumped into the air shouting Yada, when he realized there was something there. It wasn't much, just what looked like a forgotten slip of paper, but it was still enough for all that time and effort to mean something. He almost reached out to grab the paper, but resisted with the utmost restraint to check if there was some sort of spell on it first. Finding none, he finally gave in to his urge and quickly picked up the page and flicked it over. The first thing he noticed was the picture tacked onto the top right-hand corner of the page with a paperclip. An image of a young girl looked back at him sadly. Her brown eyes filled with tears as she looked into the camera. Her dark purple hair cut short around her face. He felt something in his heart tighten as he looked at the image. The girl didn't look well, sickly even with dark rings under her eyes. He wondered if she was alive. If she was still here, if she alive. He hoped so because he felt like a part of him wouldn't be right if she wasn't. He pulled the image off and placed it on the desk to get a better look at the rest of the page, quickly scanning it over and frowned at the lack of information. Not even her name was given. It said she'd been admitted here for having too much magic in her body. It wasn't a condition he'd heard of before, but it didn't sound like a pleasant experience. Apparently it had practically overloaded her body and came close to killing her. What shocked him though was how the Bureau of Magical Development had dealt with it. They decided to increase her magical power further by using he nearly chocked when he scanned over the words, having to go back and read them again to make sure he hadn't read them wrong. He couldn't believe they would on a child, no less. His jaw clenched and the paper disintegrated as his magic flared around him, a swirl of black and glowing white silver with the occasional flicker of blue and purple. They'd used an experimental electric shock treatment on her. They'd used that on a child, just to get her magical container to expand. He understood the need for progress and experimentation to attain it, but that they had just taken it way too far. Growling out loud, he did his best to calm his magic and force it back down, letting it settle beneath his skin before he looked back at the image on the desk. Picking it up, he slid the image into his pocket. He never wished more in his life to take back his actions. To take back his vow of silence about the place so he could expose the council for what they'd done here, if they were responsible. There was a chance the man had been honest in stating that communication had been sparse, which meant it hadn't been their fault it had happened. Even if that was the truth, they hadn't stepped in to stop it. Either way, it would be a long time before he ever took a mission for them again. Chapter 7. What the fuck are these things? He thought as he dodged out of the way of another humanoid-like creature. Don't get him wrong. It wasn't like they were difficult to dodge, it wasn't even like they were that difficult to destroy. The biggest problem lay in the fact that he had no idea what they were. If he had to take wild guess, he would say that they were once normal humans, mages perhaps, given that they had some form of ripped clothing on their bodies that seemed to have torn with their expanding size. But, even if they'd once been human, it's not what they were anymore. Their bodies were about twice the size of a full-grown man. Skin like a thick gray coat around their bodies with veins a stark white against the color. Strong, powerful jaws much like a wild animal's attempted to snap and bite his neck, their instincts guiding them to his jugular. He honestly had no problem with killing them. At least he wouldn't if Makarov's rule didn't keep popping into his head. That annoying rule about not being allowed to kill, valuing life and all that. Normally he wouldn't have problem with that, valuing life was important after all. But surely it didn't extend to these monstrosities. Even if they had been human once. He dodged another swipe and viciously cut the arm with his magically created claws. If he didn't start killing them, then they would eventually overwhelm him, given that they clearly had numbers on him. Naruto looked into the eyes of one of them and saw nothing but a mindless beast. Eyes blank and a mindless tune that told it to kill and destroy. What had caused it he wasn't sure. He suspected some sort of experimentation. Given what he'd recently learned about the place, he wouldn't put it past them. Still, he wasn't going to live if this kept up. Makarov would have to understand. Even they'd been human, they were monsters now. He kicked the nearest one back, pushing the others with it to get some space. Gathering his magic, he sucked in a deep breath and whispered, Yoruryu no Hoko Night Dragon's Roar. Placing both his hands in front of his mouth, a dark magic circle swirled in front of them, and he released his night magic in twisting mass of dark destruction that encompassed the entirety of the passageway as it cut through his enemies like death itself. The creatures falling to the ground as his magic forced them down. Feeling the magic lessening, he slowly lowered his hands and surveyed the destruction with a frown. He hadn't meant it to do so much damage. It was the weakest of his dragon roars. His Tsukuryu no Hoko Moon Dragon's Roar being more powerful, as well as his combination attack. He was beginning to understand what his Kasen meant about learning to temper the amount of magic he used in a spell. He was used to always going full out because the only opponent he'd ever had was a dragon. If he didn't go full out, he'd be squished like a bug. Clearly, he had to get used to the idea of not all of his opponents being that powerful. He had to get better at gauging their abilities. Reaching up, he habitually tugged on a piece of hair, as he considered what had caused these humans to turn into mindless creatures that nearly resembled anything of their former selves. As he thought earlier, experimentation was a strong possibility, but he couldn't be entirely sure about that. Jumping to conclusions just because he was pissed with the council would get him nowhere. Walking past their fallen bodies, he considered the cause. Pausing at one of them, he sent out his magic senses to see if he could find any kind of indication to what had happened. At first, he sensed nothing out of the ordinary. The body seemed perfectly fine, if a bit on the dead side. Frowning, he shook his head. It just couldn't be right, because if what he felt was correct, then the person in front of him was a completely normal human. Which was completely impossible in this situation. Even if they'd once been human, even if he couldn't sense the reason for the change, he should at least be able to sense something that indicated they weren't human. Even takeover magic left its clues. He froze. Takeover magic. It was entirely possible, he hadn't been looked for it. But if he was right, then going a bit deeper right there would mean he was right, though part of him wished he'd been wrong. It felt like takeover magic, but not. There was a wrongness about it. He was quite well versed in it, being a user, and as such he could feel the difference. This one felt different, far weaker than his own and probably any natural user of takeover magic. Still, that wasn't it. This magic, it felt so forced. Yes, it felt like it had been forced into his system and taken it over. Like a virus. But it felt artificial at the same time, completely fake. Maybe that was it. Some kind of magical infection. What could cause it to be so widespread though? He'd seen at least 20 of them so far, which really didn't add up to an experimentation. They all looked exactly the same, which indicated it was the same cause for all of them. If it had been experimentation, there would have been a visual progress or difference in their forms and power levels. As it was, they'd all been pretty similar. What could make something like that affect so many people? There was the possibility of it being spread through fluid exchange, touch, or air, like some of the viruses he'd come across, meaning it would have just required one experiment to break free and infect the rest. It might not be the cause though. While it was viable, it didn't feel quite right, and he'd always been told to trust his intuition. His intuition here said that wasn't the case. But if wasn't, then what the hell was? Twirling a different strand of hair, he continued past the body. Stalking down the passageway. A slight tingling at the edge of his sense brought about a pause though. What was that? He wondered. It felt similar to. Was that the cause perhaps? He considered. Turning down a different corridor, he followed the direction the tingling sent him, though he was careful to keep an eye out for anything else like the mutated creatures he just stumbled upon. Who knew what else was hiding in the strange building? Entering another corridor, he finally found what he'd been looking for. It had been several floors down from his original location and a few corridors down, but he'd finally got to the source of the odd magical tingle at the edge of his senses, and it looked like a leak of some sort. There was a pipe, like a smaller one of the large red ones he'd seen protruding from the building. It looked like it had burst completely, sending what looked like some sort of liquid flooding into the passageway. It was dried up now, and the pipe only occasionally leaked fresh liquid into the passageway. Picking up the similarities, his mind immediately made the link. It might have been because there were footsteps in the dried liquid that changed from normal-sized human feet in shoes to clawed feet several times bigger. That meant it was probably a fast-working infection that overpowered their base magic and forced their bodies into a transformation they should be incapable of doing. Now that he had an idea of the cause, he needed to know what this liquid was and if it could happen again. Unfortunately, he had to find the source of it if he wanted to do that. The liquid wasn't enough to go on. Sniffing the air, he took in the scent and began to follow it. His sense of smell good enough to keep track of it even if the trickle of liquid in the pipe was faint and a wall separated him from it. Walking through the corridors, he did his best not to let the place disturb him. On occasion, though, he couldn't help but check over his shoulder, the cold feeling of the magic in the area still disturbing him. Rubbing off the goosebumps on his arms, he jumped over a gaping hole in the corridor and continued to track the scent. It took longer than he'd expected, but eventually he came to a room the pipe disappeared into. The doors had been bent and were near broken, though they'd managed to stay locked closed. He wished whoever destroyed the place would have been kind enough to break them for him. Not that it would take much to break them off anyway. He was just being petty. Slotting his fingers between the sliding doors, he yanked them open. But when the air from the inside the room was let free from its confines, he fell to his knees as the smell of death and decay entered his senses. He choked and his eyes watered rapidly. Putting a hand over his nose and mouth in hopes of filtering out the air he took in the room, that he didn't have to look far before he found what he was looking for. A body, similar to the ones he'd seen before, only larger, lay strapped to a large rock with chains strapping its body to the hard surface. Holding his breath, he sent out his sense towards the body, not daring to enter the place. Upon reaching the body, he immediately noticed the difference between this one and the other ones. However this had been, they were the genuine article. A true takeover mage. The second thing he noticed was that they were dead. Not only had all the magic in their body been drained before their death, but they died in an excruciatingly slow way. Whatever they'd done to keep them in this form past magical exhaustion had been part of the reason they died. The other one being the broken pipe that was stabbed directly into their stomach. They'd bled out and died slowly. At least though he knew what had happened. Takeover magic was widely uncontrollable, and if it was forced into the body of an adult mage, then the beast would overtake them completely. A child's body could adapt, but an adult would have no hope. It had forcefully degraded those people into nothing more than wild animals with not even a fifth of the power a usual takeover granted. In fact, he'd guessed they were weaker than they had been as human mages. The mindlessness of the beasts, and the weakness of the takeover preventing real power. Noticing a fallen clipboard near the body, he steeled himself and forced himself to enter quickly, grabbing it before he rushed out, feeling his eyes tearing from the stench. Truly he hated his advanced senses right then. Finally getting a bit of distance from the room, he released his pent-up air and sucked air that simply felt gloriously clean by comparison. Sighing in relief, he looked down at the clipboard he'd managed to snag and quickly skimmed through the information. What he found wasn't pleasant. Takeover magic was one that required an innate magical gift to use. To anyone else it was simply impossible. It also made the possessor more compatible with things like transformation magic due to the similarity. But unlike transformation magic, takeover magic could not be used without an innate talent. There were few magics like that, but it was one of them. Even for people who possessed it as their innate magic, it was difficult to use, given that using it to its full potential required you to beat the creature inside you that you sought to use. Not to physically beat, but to be mentally stronger than the creature. It was either that, or if yours was amiable, you came to an agreement. He was unlucky on that front. It was one of the reasons he. Don't think about that now, Naruto, he silently admonished. You'll get distracted, then angry, then sad, then angry again. Bad combo. Shaking his head, Naruto focused on the information he'd gained. Apparently the people here were looking for a way to transfer the innate magic of one person into another by sucking it from their body and transferring it into another. From what he could glean, though, they'd failed on all accounts. Even if the children's bodies had adapted, it had simply been for their magic to absorb the other magic instead of incorporating it into their system. Eventually that had failed too, though, because the children's bodies had become so overloaded beyond their capacity they'd died. All but one. Test subject 3373. His mind immediately flashed to the picture of the girl he'd seen earlier that day. That had been the same subject number they'd given her, and yet he still had no name for the girl. Still they'd given reference to her, and it was possible that what more information on her could be found in this room chamber they'd given reference to. He wouldn't have been so fixated on her if he didn't think she was of great importance. Information on her being kept in the leader's room. Her being the only test subject that these tests had worked on. It all indicated she was central to this story in some way. Folding the paper, he placed in his pocket with the photograph. He needed to find out what happened to this girl. The closer he'd got to the room, the more things seemed to be destroyed, indicating that the destruction had originated from that place. Climbing over several piles of rubble, he pushed his way through a caved-in passageway. A part of him that wasn't annoyed at having to make his way through such destruction actually marveled at the amount of it. From the outside he'd clearly seen how bad the destruction was. The building looking like it had been collapsed near in half. But even if he'd made his way through the top half of the fallen tower, it hadn't been this bad. Sure, he'd had to use the walls as the floor, but the destruction hadn't been so evident. Now, getting closer to the source, he found himself climbing on the ceiling instead of the floor, having to sometimes blast his way through parts of caved-in passageways that had offered no pathway for him to take. He'd even had to resort to Suki no Kuraisokuman, dark side of the moon, more often than he'd like, simply because he'd wanted to avoid being crushed under unstable passageways. By the time he'd gotten to the written location, he found himself covered in an inordinate amount of dirt. He supposed it helped with camouflage, not that he really needed it, but it was useful nonetheless. Shrugging to himself, he entered the room through what appeared to be part passageway, part giant hole in the wall. Slipping quietly into the passageway, he used the shadows of the room to hide himself from any possible enemies, though he had his magic ready to cast a spell if need be. Sticking to the shadows, he checked his surroundings quickly, suddenly feeling grateful the dirt had dulled the almost luminous quality of his hair. It really was counterproductive to Margita's teachings. Glancing round the room, he quickly noted that most of the place had been destroyed and very little remained of its previous structure. From what he could glean, it seemed as if there had previously been a large dugout at the center of the room, spanning several meters across and deep, though it was now impressively filled rubble that looked as if it had caved in from the ceiling, though part of it still remained intact. He actually wished it wasn't, because a magic that felt like brush with death was rolling off the statue. He shivered. Sensing no magical signatures in the room, he slipped further inside, though after his previous errors he was careful to keep his guard up. He sniffed at the air just to be sure there wasn't anyone in the room with him. The room seemed to smell like the rest of the place, at least at first. There was something, just a hint of something, that smelled different from the cold death that lingered about the place. It was an old smell, something that should have faded with time. However, it seemed to be lingering about the wires that hung from the sides of what was once the hole at the center of the room. Moving closer, he inspected the wires, breathing in deeply as he took in the smell. Smells were something hard to forget, and could often be ingrained into your subconscious without realizing it. This one was beautiful. He never thought to call a scent beautiful, and yet it was. It smelt of roses and ice. Like a cold winter's day in the mountains. It reminded him of the winter months in the moutons. He'd been trained to ignore the snow, having grown up in a place that was often coated in ice during the winter months. It allowed him to appreciate its beauty more. This smell reminded him of that place. Of home, and a feeling of nostalgia set in. Yet, he could feel it had been tainted. The natural smell had been tainted by something dark and acrid. He felt upset that someone dared taint something so beautiful, something so pure. He was aware it was irrational, and only Margita's training allowed him to keep his emotions in check. When he met Brain, he was going to destroy the bastard. In fact, if he met him now, he would destroy him. S-class mage or not. Luckily for him, though, another group of takeover mutants had decided to hunt him down. Normally he preferred to avoid this confrontation if he could, but these creatures had clearly just offered themselves up as sacrifice. It was a large group too, around 30 of them. Grinning viscously as he took in his opponents, he allowed his cold anger to flourish. Margita would disapprove, he was sure, but at the moment he wasn't sure he cared. He was going to destroy these mutts, and then he was going to destroy this place. Wipe it from history so that no child ever had to undergo what this one had. He only wished he'd managed to find out her name. Cracking his knuckles, he flared his magic as the beasts circled him. Come on, beasties, show me what you got. Yes, Margita would definitely have disapproved of his violent actions, though not the moral code he followed. So, you completed the mission? Asked the man, who once again hid his face in the shadows of his hat. Yes, he replied, going through every effort possible to keep his face relaxed and neutral. Even clenching his jaw would be a dead giveaway of his feelings towards the man and that place. Everything destroyed. Like it never existed. Just as you ordered, he answered. Did you manage to find out what happened there? He inquired. Taking a deep breath, Naruto explained. It would appear that they had been conducting experiments that the council would have disapproved of. At least he hoped they would have disapproved, and had the leader had decided it best he keep these to himself, giving you only simple reports without detail. And these experiments were? Originally it appeared they were aiming to force one innate magic into another. However, this endeavor seemed to fail, leaving all subjects dead. All but one, that is. Instead of incorporating a new innate magic into the subject's system, it seemed to expand their magical containers. At least in the case of the children. The adults or subjects beyond puberty seemed to die or be taken over by the innate magic forced upon them, turning into nothing but mindless beasts. However, you killed them, correct? Naruto nodded stiffly. It was bad enough he had to talk so much, but interrupting him made it worse. Good, carry on then. They changed tactics. Instead of trying to incorporate innate magic into individuals, they took the ability to expand a person's magical container instead. But it only worked on one subject. Born with too much magic, her magical container, it seemed the experiment succeeded on her, he explained. Fascinating, and a name? He resisted, gripping the photograph in his pocket tightly. No name was given. Pity, he murmured. Naruto contemplated smashing the guy's head into the wall, but held back. He'd probably be unsuccessful anyway. Given the difference in their power level. Did you happen to find why communication stopped? When I arrived, the building seemed to have been destroyed in several places. My investigation indicates it was caused from the inside out, not the other way around. There was no evidence to indicate it, but I think one of their test subjects did it. It went unspoken which test subject he meant. Good, you are dismissed. Collect your reward from the servant outside the door. Bowing stiffly, Naruto made his way out the room. And boy, he stopped with his hand on the handle. Don't try tell anyone about this. You know the consequences of a magical oath after all. Indeed he did, though he'd be searching for a way out as soon as he got the chance. Even if he couldn't bring the acts of the council to light, he refused to keep himself bound by an oath. An oath that went against his nature. Nonetheless, he nodded his head in agreement and submission. Yes, sir, he murmured. Good boy, off you go then. He bristled at being treated like nothing more than a common pet, but did his best to shake it off. It wouldn't do to attack a council member. Closing the door behind him, he frowned. He needed to find a way to remove and find out who that girl in the picture is. Chapter 8. The moment Naruto walked into the guild, he was attacked. Although, a better description would be that someone attempted to attack him. Someone with pink hair who wasn't even tall enough to reach his shoulder, perhaps not even his chest. Someone that charged him with a loud yell. Fight me! He cried as he jumped with a fist full of fire at the blonde. Reacting instinctively, Naruto stepped lightly to the side, letting the boy fall past him before slamming his leg into the boy's back, sending him flying into the hard wooden doors. Blinking rapidly at the odd happening, Naruto watched the strange human slowly peel himself off the door, leaving a remarkable large indent behind in his place. Turning round to face the rest of the guild who were staring at the scene, he raised a brow and asked, "What just happened?" Before anyone could respond to the question, the pink-haired boy jumped back to his feet. Seemingly recovered from his body-to-door encounter, he jumped into what Naruto guessed to be some sort of loose fighting stance, and started bouncing up and down on his toes. His body brimming with energy. "Fight me!" he once again declared. Naruto furrowed his brow. "Why do you want to fight me, little girl?" Natsu froze where he stood. The punk had just called him a girl. He was unfortunately unaware that Naruto had trouble differentiating between boys and girls when they were young. "I'm a boy!" he shouted, swinging once again at Naruto's face and once again missing. "But your hair is pink," Naruto pointed out most obviously. So, what's that got to do with it? Naruto reached up to twirl a piece of hair with a confused look on his face. Kana said that pink is a girl's color. The girl in question quickly hid behind the bar. She did not want her new pink-haired guild member to take it out on her. It wasn't her fault, honestly. She just noticed Naruto had trouble telling the difference between them. Apparently he'd had an odd upbringing, so she decided to help in her own way, being explaining clothing, hair length and colors normally associated with each. While Natsu certainly dressed like a boy and had short hair, it was undeniably pink, which she'd said to Naruto was a clear indicator the person was a girl. She damned her helpful nature. The small boy stared at Naruto in shock for several moments before sprinting away from him, fists still blazing, screaming for Kana to come out from wherever she was hiding. Naruto wasn't sure how safe that was inside a wooden structure, but ignored it. At least the kid wasn't badgering him anymore. The boy was just lucky it was afternoon, and not midday. Shaking his head in disbelief, Naruto moved over to bar and slid into a stool next to Laxus, still feeling slightly dazed by the odd greeting. He turned to face the taller boy. "I take it that is the new guild member you wanted me to meet?" he asked. "Hi," he replied with a grin, a teasingly lilt still in his voice. "Notice anything odd about him, other than the fact that he attacked me?" Laxus nodded. "He's extremely loud and will probably be the cause of many headaches in the future. Other than that, well, he did feel kind of familiar, you know. Like I should know him, or I've met him before, even if I'm quite sure I haven't. I'm sure Kasan mentioned something about it, but for the life of me I just can't remember what," he murmured as he fiddled with his hair and thought. Laxus grinned. This was going to be good. "He claims to be a dragon slayer." Naruto paused for a moment to consider his words and to get over the surprise of meeting another dragon slayer so suddenly before nodding his head. "She did mention something like that. Anyway, I got to go see the master." "Is he in his office?" "Hi, what you need him for?" "Nothing really, just a little problem on my mission." "Well, he's in his office if you need him," Laxus replied, deciding it was best not to ask Naruto about what had happened. The pale blonde looked troubled and they hadn't known each other long enough for him to suddenly become a confidant. "Arigato," he replied with a nod of his head. Heading to the back of the room, he knocked on an easy-to-miss door, waiting for Makarov's acknowledgement before slipping inside. "Master," he greeted with a small bow. "Ah, Naruto, to what do I owe the pleasure?" he greeted with a grin and a wave of his hand indicating for Naruto to sit in one of the unoccupied seats in front of his desk. Abiding by his request, Naruto situated himself on one of the chairs, leaning back against the rest, though keeping himself ready for any form of battle. Margita had ingrained this into him through various sneak attacks throughout his training. It was better to be prepared, else he would regret it. "I recently took a mission request off the board from the council, or at least one man from the council," he began, answering Makarov's earlier question. I'd hoped one of the other guilds would accept it before someone here did." Naruto nodded. "I would have left it alone myself if not for an unfortunate curious streak and a need for the large reward they offered. Anyway, I just thought I'd let you know that I took it, and I'd tell you what I can about it." "You can't tell me everything?" he asked. "There have been certain restrictions placed on what I can and can't tell you," he replied stiffly, only just managing to find the words that would allow him to explain without breaking anything. He could feel the spell restricting what he could say. "Oh, one of those, eh?" Naruto nodded. "There is little I can tell you, but the bare minimum. I am going to be searching for a way around it, though. So, when I find out how, I'll tell you everything," Naruto explained. He then remembered a request he needed to make, "which reminds me, before I forget, could I request a bit of time to eventually head over to the magic library to research the problem? Just a week once a month or so." Makarov nodded his head in agreement. "Sure, good. Anyway, there's not much I can tell you really. It was a request from the Magic Council to he search for a word he could say, look into certain events pertaining to the Bureau of Magical Development. The request was made by a man whose face I couldn't see and whose name I don't know. He wore a hat that kept his face in the shadows. I'm surprised I could actually say that much about him. Perhaps he didn't target his identity when he cast the spell," Makarov suggested. Naruto hummed in agreement. "It's possible. Well, there seems to be greater restrictions placed upon what I can say about the place than him. All I think I can say is that several he wanted to say experiments, but found the words lodged in his throat." Sighing, he continued, "Several discoveries were made in regards to once again the words lodged in his throat." Now he was actually getting irritated. In regards to the magical container and its advancement, he couldn't say more than that. Not even mention the mutated takeover creatures or the fact that he harmed them. It was irritating in the extreme. Then he remembered something. It wouldn't let him say that, but it would help at least. Digging into his pocket, he pulled out the picture of the girl he'd stored there, taking a moment to look at her young face before handing it over to Makarov. "This is an image of one of the subjects there. Perhaps you can identify her." Taking the image, Makarov glanced over it with a frown on his face. "She's familiar in some odd way, but I don't know who she is." Sighing, Naruto took back the picture and slid it into his pocket. He'd hoped the master would have had an idea who she was. "I'm sorry, that's all I can tell you, master. I was hoping to be able to get out more, but apparently not." "That's fine, Naruto. Something is better than nothing," he responded. Standing up, Naruto gave Makarov a small bow and headed for the door. "Arigato, master." Now I just need to find an apartment, he thought. Then I can finally look at those books Margita left at the back of the cave. She said they would teach me things she hadn't had the time to explain properly. I hope it's something awesome. He hadn't looked at them yet because he'd wanted to make sure they weren't something extremely top secret before opening. He didn't want someone trying to steal them or something like that. They'd been given to him by his Kasan and he wasn't going to let anyone get their hands on them. He felt like he'd seen 100 apartments. He knew it hadn't been that many, but it sure felt like it. It wasn't like he searched for fault with every apartment he looked at. It was more like the faults were thrown in his face. All of them had some kind of problem, from the location to the money to the size. He just couldn't find the right one. But finally now, he had found one that seemed just right. He didn't want to say it out loud in case he jinxed it or something, but he thought it might be the one. He didn't want to sound like a lovesick fool either, but the place seemed perfect for him. A small one-bedroom apartment near enough to fairy tale for a civilian to walk it in about 10 minutes. It wasn't overly large for certain, but it was big enough for him. A small kitchen, living room and a clean bathroom. It was also built in one of the newer buildings in town, which meant it hadn't been lived in much before. Restraining the grin he felt like giving the landlord, he checked round the place once more to make sure nothing was wrong with it. Other than the fact that it was largely unfurnished, there didn't seem to be a problem. The walls were painted a nice pale cream, the floors a light wood color, and there didn't seem to be any sort of holes or infestation in the walls or ceiling. It was also a pretty decently priced. He'd only be renting, but that wasn't a problem. He was hoping to get a house when he eventually built up the money, or when he made S-class. Then he'd be able to consistently take higher-paying missions. He doubted he'd easily find a mission that paid as well as the one he'd just been on. Spinning round to face the landlord, he finally allowed himself to grin. "I'll take it." His landlord, however, left much to be desired. The short man with hardly any hair on his head, and an oddly shaped face that made Naruto think of salmon, seemed unable to be, incapable of smiling. His face set in a sullen frown full of disdain. "I don't accept any late payments, got it? I want that 80,000 jewels by the end of every month, and if I don't get it, you're out." "I won't accept anything less, mage," he finished with venom. Naruto raised a brow. Clearly the man had something against mages. He hadn't a clue what, but it was obvious the man wasn't going to suddenly turn into a fan of his at any rate. Sighing and automatically reaching up to tug on one of his shaggy locks, he nodded. "Hi, and I expect your first payment now," he said with a hand held out. Not wanting to give away how much money he had on hand, Naruto waved him off. "I'll come by your desk later today." "Is that fine?" The man looked like he wanted to argue, but gave up and nodded. The boy wasn't going against what he asked after all, but he was feeling slightly dubious about the whole thing. For one, the boy didn't look older than 14, he could perhaps push for a young-looking 15-year-old, but the man doubted it. The boy's growth pattern indicated a younger age. For two, the boy was mage. That in itself was a big enough reason. Unfortunately, he couldn't just turn the boy away. He was a paying customer, and he'd been looking for someone to rent the room for a while. "Make sure that you do," he said to the pale boy before turning and leaving the room with a frown. "Arigato," Naruto said in thanks, though the man failed to return the courtesy. Watching the man leaving the apartment, waiting for the telltale click of the door closing before quickly threw his bag to floor. Reaching into the bag, he pulled out a smaller beige bag. The bag filled with the books his Ka-san had left for him. Sitting with the bag in front of him on the floor, he suddenly found himself hesitant. This was the last gift he'd ever received from his mother. When he opened this, he would know what was inside, but at the same time it would no longer be. He didn't know how to put it into words. He just knew it would be different. Perhaps that was part of the reason he hadn't looked yet. It was something he'd never admit, but there seemed to be some truth there. Sighing, he reached up ahead to fiddle with his hair, but stopped mid-movement, letting his hand floor to the floor with a soft thud. He really needed to let go of whatever was stopping him from opening the bag and just get it over and done with. Rip it off like his Ka-san tortuously liked doing to his bandages. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the side of the bag. His hands were shaking, but with another deep breath he managed to steady them. "And now," he thought as he pulled open the bag with a violent tug. He released the breath he'd been holding with relief before turning his gaze back to the inside of the bag. Taped to the top was a note with his mother's messy scrawl. Messy only because she'd had to try and write in such a small place when her nail was similar in size to his whole body. It should have been impossible, but she practiced over a long period of time to get it to an acceptable level. Pulling the note out, he quickly read over it. "Naruto, these books have got me through some hard times. Some really lonely times, and now I think it's time I pass them on to you. You're just lucky I keep an extra copy of everything over wise I'd never part with them. A wise man many years ago wrote them. Now I give his glorious gift of knowledge to you. Feel grateful to your predecessor for introducing them to me. Otherwise the world would be a much duller place. Take care of these books, Naruto, or else I will find a way to get to you. Love, your Ka-san." Blinking in surprise at the way his Ka-san had practically waxed lyrical about the books, Naruto raised an eyebrow before sliding the note into his pocket with the picture he still kept there. It would be nice to have a memento of his Ka-san. Even if it was an oddly out-of-character letter, the only part seemingly in character being her threat at the end. Deciding the books must be good if Margita had enjoyed them so much, he pulled one off the top. Ika Ika, he read out loud as he took in the front cover. A scantily clad woman being chased by a man. Raising an eyebrow at the odd picture, he flipped to the back of the book, seeing a picture of a grinning man with wild white hair and a single red line going down either side of his face from eye corner to jaw. He cocked his head. The man was certainly odd-looking. There was also a small biographical description at the bottom of the man, who seemed to be called Jiraiya. Apparently he'd been a wandering mage, considering himself to be a toad sage due to his ability to summon toads. It certainly seemed to be an interesting magic. Checking the date of publication, Naruto nearly chalked. This book was written some 400 years ago. Yes, he knew when the last dragon slayers had been taught, but it was one thing to know and another thing to see it so casually in a book from the era. Pushing back that thought, he slowly pulled back the front page to read the text in front of him. Surely it held a well of information that could truly bring him to new levels. As soon as he began reading, he realized that it was not a text on magic, but rather a fictional story book. Frowning as he continued further on, he wondered why his Ka-san wanted him to read such a thing. Surely it couldn't be that important. But he continued, perhaps the secrets lay somewhere in the book. On round about the 6th page, the story, Naruto's eyebrows nearly disappeared into his hair, though he quickly controlled and ordered the expression on his face into something more neutral. Had he been a more conventionally raised boy, he probably would have been a red-faced, stuttering, bloody-nosed idiot by this point, either continuing out of perversion, flung it away in disgust, or passed out due to blood loss. As it was, he continued with an almost sick fascination as he read the acts that took place in the book. When he first started reading the passage, he'd almost put the book down in disbelief. However, the knowledge that his Ka-san had ordered him to read the books had him continue on through, going from porn-filled passage to porn-filled passage as a whole world of information now flooded his brain. It seemed so absurd, and yet, suddenly a whole lot of things made so much sense. At first he hadn't believed it, but the more he read, the more it just seemed so normal. What he couldn't understand was why his Ka-san had left him these books. He knew enough to understand it simply wasn't normal for mothers to leave their sons' books filled with sex. It just made no sense on any level to him. He also didn't understand why his Ka-san hadn't told him sooner, in fact why she hadn't told him herself. It would have been awkward as all hell, but surely it made more sense. It was only when he got to the last word on the last page that all his confusion was answered. As soon as he read the last word on the page, the note in his pocket vibrated. Feeling confused, he quickly pulled it out, and noticed the writing on it had changed from what it said originally. He didn't know how she'd done it, but it was a clever idea for sure. Reading the note, an almost deadpan stare crossed his face. Naruto, I'm sure you're confused as to why I've left you these books rather than tell you in person. Or why I didn't tell you sooner. In fact, I bet you're wondering why I made you read such perverse literature in the first place, considering I'm your Ka-san. Naruto wondered if she'd read his present mind in the past. It all seemed so accurate. Perhaps it just showed how well she knew him. Well, the answer is quite simple. I like to mess with your mind. A fact which you well know. In fact, I not only like to mess with your mind, I like to do it in the most complex way possible. I've not only messed with your mind in the ways you think, but in even more elaborate ways, because now you have to live knowing that not only is your Ka-san a pervert, but that you read the same books too. Love, your Ka-san. P.S. I expect you to finish those books. I'll know if you didn't. I will know. Naruto stared at the piece of paper in disbelief. He gazed at the paper in his hands for several moments, then turned his gaze on the books before returning back to the note. If he were a normal boy, he'd probably be in tears at this point. As it was, he couldn't stop the little smirk that flitted across his face. It was so like his Ka-san to mess with him like this. Even if a part of him did feel like finding her and attempting to beat the crap out of her, failure was guaranteed. The greater part of him was filled with a sense of nostalgia. He wasn't sure if that's what Margita had intended with the prank, but it was the result nonetheless. Shaking his head, he pocketed the note. He'd go out to buy himself some furniture, or at least look at some, to make his apartment more habitable, and when he was done with that, he would read those books. He had to, after all. Else his Ka-san find out otherwise. She'd come up with her plan when he'd been in the middle of training. Meditating further up the mountain, leaving her alone in her cave. Grinning in triumph, she went to the back of the cave and dragged out from a hidden spot in the wall a bag filled with old perverse books. A preservation charm on the bag to protect them from aging. It was her previous dragon slayer's work. She'd loved these books. Margita was suddenly beyond grateful for the girl's perverse side. She thought Margita hadn't known, but she had. Nothing could escape her. Even if it had irritated her, it was now a part of her mastermind scheme, her scheme to turn her son into an anti-pervert. She thought that if she just didn't give him the birds and the bees talk, it would save him from the perverts of the world. But she didn't trust the rest of the humans not to corrupt her son. She would have to find a way to do it herself, a way to disturb him so badly he never walked that side of life. Her plan could not fail. Margita had never read the books herself, but her son didn't have to know that. If he thought he'd read the same perverted books as his mother, surely it would disgust and disturb him to the point where he'd never turn to that side. Yes, it would work. Best of all, it would be disguised as a simple way to mess with his mind. Well, she confessed it would be messing with his mind. Just not in the way he expected it would. I will save you, Naruto-kun. Yes, those people will never corrupt you in such a way. I won't let another child of mine fall to the dark side, she thought as she began her mastermind plan. Chapter 9. Laxus. Hi. If you don't somehow grow the balls to attack me very soon, then it's quite possible I'll die of old age before it happens. There was silence for several moments before Laxus sent an arch of lightning flying at Naruto with a wave of his hand. Twisting his body to the side, Naruto shifted out of the way just in time to watch the lightning speed past the right side of his face. Giving Laxus a fanged grin, he returned with his own wave of blinding white widespread magic that lacked the power of even his weakest dragon roars, but could target a larger area, which he knew was a good move given Laxus's speed. His estimation was proved right when he saw Laxus having to waste magical energy to forcibly carve his way through the magic. Come on, Laxus, you can't have been serious with that attack, he taunted. He knew taunting an opponent just because you held the temporary upper hand was never a good move, but at the moment it was necessary. Laxus saw him as a friend and as such didn't want to attack him in case he accidentally harmed him. It was a good caution, he supposed, given that they were around equal power, meaning both would have to go all out to keep up with the other. If one had been weaker or greatly stronger than the other, it would have made the situation easier to deal with. Hands on his knees, Laxus looked up and glared at Naruto. Remind me why I'm doing this again. I need training to perfect a technique, and you want my help with the magic that Lacrima could give you. It's a trade-off. A good one too, given that we're the best people to help each other in this situation. Besides, it's good training either way, Naruto replied. Looking back down at his feet, Laxus nodded before shifting back into a fighting stance. Fine, but I hope you're ready to take a beating. Naruto shrugged, before giving him another grin. We'll see. There was absolute stillness for several moments before both opponents shifted quickly into action. Lightning sparked round Laxus's body before he launched himself at Naruto's body at speeds hardly visible to the human eye. Catching Laxus by surprise, Naruto muttered a quick spell under his breath and instead of dodging, took his attack full on in a manner of speaking. Instead of his lightning-surrounded fist connecting with Naruto, he found himself flying straight through him, only his magic allowing him to change directions quickly and avoid falling to the floor. What the hell? He thought in surprise, but he didn't allow it to deter him, rushing Naruto again only to receive the same result. He growled in irritation, launching a quick flurry of punches and kicks, the feeling of frustration growing as none of them connected. He was almost ready to ask Naruto himself what he was doing when suddenly it clicked in his mind. He knew Naruto was the Moon and Night Dragon Slayer. What he'd forgotten was his research on his power. Not Dragon Slayer magic, but rather the element he represented. Moon magic at its core was negation magic, negating the effects of spells. Naruto seemed to take this a step further and turn into a literal ghost, not feeling the effects of magic or matter. It didn't appear though that he was able to cast other magic when he was using the spell. The only way he could to remove that form was to create too much magical power to negate. Stepping back, he chanted with his fist raised into the air, resounding through the air, the roar of thunder, plunged from the heavens and reaped destruction. Gasping in surprise as he watched the gathering of magical power above him, Naruto quickly released the spell, knowing he wasn't yet able to withstand that kind of magical blast. This was going to cost him to defend against. Gathering his magic in both of his hands, he raised them above his head to guard himself and murmured, Hikari Kara Shahai, shielding from the light. A shell of darkness began to grow from his raised fists, growing and shaping until a shield completely surrounded his body. He just hoped the spell worked against lightning. Then the light came crashing down upon him. A ball of lightning like he'd never seen before. Groaning at the pressure, he fell to his knees as the strain pushed against his shield. Forcing more magic into his shield, he took several deep breaths, searching for his center in the raging storm. His shield was not designed for lightning precisely. It was made to protect against those who used sun or light magic, that which was his natural opposite. Lightning, while similar, wasn't exactly the same, and it was costing him. For a moment Laxus felt his heart stop. Afraid he'd actually killed his friend as the dust cloud around Naruto failed to clear. Then he heard a cough and a muttered curse before a concentrated blast of slivery white magic was sent straight at him. Not having time to defend with his own, he dodged with a spark of lightning before launching himself at the source of the magic. Clearing the dust with his quick movement, Naruto was there to meet him with the gravity set heavy upon his body, arms raised like a cross in front of him. The collision had the ground shaking and a shockwave blasting the air around the outwards. Lightening the gravity, Naruto quickly twisted his body round Laxus's fist. You're in some night claws, he murmured, slashing at Laxus' unprotected back. Fortunately for the older boy, he had quick reflexes and managed to dodge out the way, receiving only light scratches across instead of the deep slashes he would have received. Instead, hardly noticing the injury, he returned with his own kick to Naruto's side that the paler teen dodged with a quick lightning of gravity. Leaving it that way, he grabbed onto Laxus's shoulder, digging his claws in deep before contorting his body round and launching a kick at his side. Blocking the limbs, Laxus raised the lighting power arching round his body and forced Naruto to let go with a hiss. Moving further apart from each other, they glared across the field. That spell hurt. Well, your ghosting was annoying me, Laxus replied. Learned anything useful? A bit, though I think Natsu's would be more suited to me than yours. You're probably right, but I'll talk more about the basics later. In the end you have to make it your own anyway, Naruto agreed. I suppose, he murmured. Did fighting me help you get any closer to perfecting that technique? Every fight helps. Laxus raised an eyebrow. Fine, it was helpful. Arigato and all that, he replied. It was good training anyway. There was silence for several moments before Laxus spoke. Want to carry on? Naruto grinned. I thought you'd never ask. Flaring their magic, auras shaping round them, they readied their attacks. Preparing to fire a blast, they were both stopped mid-spell by the sudden appearance of a little girl with white hair in the middle of their fight, freezing both of them. You shouldn't be fighting. A little boy. She's a girl, Naruto. Remember Kana's lesson. Look at the dress plus it's pink. How did you miss that? He interrupted. Oh, right. Little girl, we're not really fighting, we're. Lee-sana, called out a loud feminine voice. Am I ever going to finish? Muttered Naruto, only to be interrupted again, this time by a loud male voice. Lee-sana, I give up. He sighed, releasing the magic he'd built up, Laxus giving him a smirk before doing the same. Look, Tiny, we weren't really fighting. The small girl, now identified as Lee-sana, still continued to frown though, in obvious disbelief. But you were hurting each other. Well, Laxus started, sometimes that happens when trained. Suddenly a taller white-haired girl came stumbling out the forest, not really noticing anything, but the small girl standing in the middle of the clearing. She breathed a sigh of relief and ran forward, giving the girl a tight hug. Don't scare me like that, Marine, the girl said with a smile. See, it happens to you too, Naruto pointed out to Laxus. Inside though, there was a little white-haired man in his head representing his inner pervert that was giving the girl a good look up and down. Too young now, but she has potential, it whispered. The older boy resisted, sticking his tongue out at the pale teen. He'd never be caught dead doing something so childish. His words, however, did have the result of alerting the new arrival to their presence in the clearing. Realizing she wasn't alone, the older girl, presumably a sibling given their similar appearance, stood protectively in front of her sister, trying to guard the girl from both sides. What did you do to my sister? She asked, doing her best to look as menacing as possible. Oh, she will be wild in bed one day. You got that from one comment? Naruto asked, questioning this perverted voice. One very commanding comment. How can you not see it? The perverted voice pled. Naruto mentally shook his head. Why do you assume we did anything to her? Because you probably did, she replied, giving him a dark look. Naruto, Laxus thought, why couldn't you have just said we did nothing? Now this whole stupid thing could escalate. Both the boys stared at her for several moments, unsure exactly what to say when the increasingly awkward moment was interrupted by another arrival. He came tumbling through the bush far less gracefully than the last arrival, landing roughly on his hands and knees before scrambling back to his feet and wiping the dust off his blue suit. Looking round, he took in the scene in front of him. Gomen, I hope we didn't interrupt anything. Elfin-chan, shouted Lee-sana, clearly distracted from her earlier vendetta against Naruto and Laxus, starting a run towards him with arms wide open and a big smile on her face. She was unfortunately stopped by the older girl, who grabbed the back of her dress and plopped her back behind her. Later, Lee-sana, Elfman, come here quick, she ordered, her nervousness at the situation hidden beneath a commanding exterior. Using the time the boy was walking over to the two girls, Naruto quickly searched them with his magic, immediately noticing at the start they were all mages, or at least had the potential to be, with a decent amount of magical power. Looking deeper, he felt himself almost slip into a state of shock. How could they all use takeover magic? He thought in shock. It was clear from his findings that they all had innate takeover magic, each one seeming to be slightly different from the other, as most magics are, but it was takeover magic he felt. Pushing past the shock he felt for now, he searched deeper, feeling a similarity in all their magics, a link that seemed to join them. Something he'd begun to learn meant close familial relation between all of them, siblings most likely, though the boy didn't look as similar as the two girls did. It did explain, though, the fact that they all had takeover magic. It wasn't uncommon among siblings. It was still a shock to him. He didn't think he'd ever come across other takeover users. It wasn't exactly a common magic. Perhaps they could help him. He hadn't tried in a while. Not since he'd arrived at Fairy Tail, too worried about what might happen if he failed. It had been a while, but he still hadn't forgotten the scar he'd left. He shook his head. Not the time to reminisce, Naruto. We weren't doing anything to her, Laxus explained with his hands raised in a placating manner. A likely story, the older girl hissed. She was clearly the oldest, despite being shorter than the boy. Her demeanor not only agreeing with his assessment, but her magic too. It felt more aged and potent than that of her siblings. Her takeover magic definitely more familiar to him than either of theirs. Slightly demonic in ways theirs was not. Given his recent discovery, Naruto, ignoring common courtesy, decided to get straight to the point, interrupting the repetitive conversation. You use takeover magic? Laxus winced, right to the point as usual. Who told you that? She asked, her face now more easily reflecting her agitation. Nobody, I could just sense it in your magic. It is familiar to me, he explained. Laxus raised a brow. He'd forgotten about that. Naruto had only mentioned it in passing and he'd never seen him use it, so it was easy to forget that Naruto's innate magic was takeover. Having also taken the time to sense them out, he detected the similarities and familiarity in their magic, though he'd been unable to identify what it was. Now it was more clear that the familiarity was the undertone he always felt in Naruto's magic. Why is it so familiar to you? You have not taken the time to sense it? He asks with a furrowed brow of confusion. The girl looked around Urza's age, which was certainly old enough to have learned, though he wasn't sure if Urza herself could. The girl flushed. I only learned how recently, and it's not my best. Oh, then I see no reason to tell you, Naruto replied with a wave of dismissal. When you learn how to sense it, you'll figure it out. She glared at him. Laxus sighed. There's no need to antagonize her, Naruto. You told me. It wasn't meant to antagonizing, and I only told you because we're teammates and friends. Teammates? Interrupted a small voice from behind the taller girl. Yes, teammates. We belong to the same guild, Laxus explained. Then why were you fighting? You even said you're friends. She asked as she held onto the back of her sister's shorts. That's what we've been trying to explain. We weren't fighting, just training, Laxus said. Oh, she said in surprise. Mireille? Hi. We can go now. They weren't fighting, she explained with a big smile on her face. The boy who had a protective hand on her shoulder knelt down to her level. What do you mean? Well, I came here to stop them fighting. But they weren't fighting, which means I don't have to stop them anymore. So we can go, she said, still smiling. The oldest of them sighed and ran her fingers through white wavy hair. So, all this happened for nothing? Not nothing. Oh, really? The girl asked with a raised brow. Lisanna nodded. Hi, now we can ask for directions. She turned to face the boys. Mireille doesn't have the best sense of dire. A hand clamped over her mouth, and the older girl flushed. Don't tell them that, Lisanna. Laxus snickered, and she shot him a death glare. But, at least the situation seemed defused for the most part. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, said the pale blonde, deciding it best to introduce himself. He didn't think calling the older two Alpha Ai-chan and Mireille would work too well. And the idiot laughing over there is Laxus Dreyer. Who's an idiot now? Laxus asked with a raised brow. Nothing you need to worry about, Laxus, he replied, reached up a hand to fiddle with his hair, turning to face the siblings at the center of the clearing. And you are? Mary Jane Strauss, she said, introducing herself. And these are my brother and sister Elfman and Lisanna. Naruto nodded his head at them in acknowledgement of the introduction. What place are you looking for? Mary Jane flushed. Did he have to bring that up again? Fairy Tail Guild, said Elfman when Mary Jane failed to reply. Do you know where it is? Laxus and Naruto shared a look. Laxus smirked and replied, Sure, we can even take you there if you want. Really? Exclaimed the smallest girl with a smile. Her blue eyes shining with delight. Cause if Mireille gets us lost again, a hand was once again clamped over her mouth. We'd appreciate the help. Naruto shrugged. Just follow us then. Won't they mind if you just barge in there? Don't you belong to another guild? Both teens shrugged and spoke simultaneously. They'll get over it. As soon as Naruto opened the doors to allow them through, he raised his fist directly in front of his face just in time for Natsu to collide with it. The pink-haired boy then flopping down to the ground in a heap. One day I shall defeat you and Laxus too, he mumbled from his place on the floor. When I'm old and decrepit I might agree with you, Naruto replied before continuing to walk inside. Lisanna seemed to take offense to his actions though and bent down next to the downed boy. Are you okay? Natsu nodded dazedly from his position on the floor and gave her a shaky thumbs up. She frowned and turned to Naruto. Why'd you do that? He shrugged. Natsu seems to take joy in attacking me every time I walk into the guild. I'm hoping it's something he grows out of, but in the meantime I find it best to just knock him out as quick as possible. It usually discourages him from trying for the rest of the day. The little girl pouted up at him, but didn't argue any further. The way Naruto phrased that sentence though made something in Mary Jane's mind click. She cocked her head to the side and with a raised eyebrow gave Naruto a look that would have had lesser men quacking in their boots. What exactly do you mean by that? By what exactly? By that every time you walk into the guild. You say it as if you do that often? Well, I do. After all, I am a member of Fairy Tail, he replied with a grin. You must have a death wish, she said, giving him a deadpan stare. I'm with you on that, Laxus interjected. No need to be cruel. Anyone with common sense could have figured it out. It's not my fault you couldn't, Naruto replied. Mary Jane growled. What if Naruto falls in love with a dragon in a fairy tale? And thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel. And leave a like if you guys need the next part. Comment down and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.